Chapter 172. None of my enemies survived. Li Tianlan appreciated this famous saying of Dongqing Wudi, the god of massacre in Zhongzhou state. This was Marshal Dongqing Wudi's declaration to the whole dark world, but for Li Tianlan, it was also the most basic principle in his life. The dark world was the most naked and simple world. Right and wrong, good and evil, right and wrong, were all mixed into the purest blood and black. There was no right or wrong here, only doing or not doing. Enemies deserved to die. This was the simplest truth. Only by killing the enemy could one live. Even an idiot could understand it. Li Tianlan didn't want to judge whether Jiang Shangyu was a good person or a bad person. Simple judgment was actually the most childish behavior in the dark world. Fighting, killing, involving, cooperation, compromise, everything was for the interests and desires that constantly fluctuated in the general trend. How could it be good or bad? Jiang Shangyu had helped Li Tianlan. It had to be admitted that in nearly a week, Jiang Shangyu's professional lurking skills had also reduced a lot of trouble for Li Tianlan. The cooperative hunting between the two could also be said to be a pleasant experience. Even if they got along seriously, Jiang Shangyu could even be regarded as a good person. But he was an enemy. Enemy. That word was enough. From the standpoint of his own survival, if Jiang Shangyu wanted to kill him, then he had to die. He didn't care about the means, the past, or the grudges as long as he died. This was the dark world. Brutal, pure, and dark. The moment the muzzle of the sky attack was pressed against Jiang Shangyu's chest, there was only calmness in Li Tianlan's eyes. He pulled the trigger. The moment the bullet was fired, the vortex formed in the air swirled wildly. He saw a large amount of blood mist burst out of Jiang Shangyu's body, and his body was blasted into the forest 100 meters away. Li Tianlan just pursed his lips and his face was pale and indifferent. The vortex ahead surged. A very dazzling silver light flashed in front of Li Tianlan, and then went straight down. It was like a drop of strange liquid. In that instant, it emitted a bright light and then became incomparably dim. However, this drop of liquid fell from above and was not torn apart by the air vortex in front of it. Instead, it directly passed through the extremely distorted air flow and fell straight to the ground. Li Tianlan, who had once again exhausted all his strength, subconsciously reached out and caught the drop of silver liquid in his hand. His tense joints relaxed completely this time, making a crackling sound. He gasped and sat directly on the ground. The air vortex caused by Sky Strike gradually slowed down. Li Tianlan took a deep breath and looked at the drop of liquid in his hand, frowning slightly. To be precise, it was not a water droplet, but a semi-solidified liquid. It had a terrifyingly high temperature and when it landed on his hand, it was like magma. The liquid slid slightly in Li Tianlan's hand. Although it was liquid, its structure was not loose at all, which showed its great density. To put it bluntly, this little drop was like a special alloy after melting or some other substance. Alloy? Li Tianlan's face changed and he suddenly looked up at the forest ahead. His body instinctively stood up and made a sprinting movement. But just after 2 steps, he swayed and fell to the ground again. In the forest about 100 meters ahead, the night rain mixed with grass and leaves shot into the air at the same time. Large swaths of turf and soil rose up, blocking the view. Vaguely, a figure quickly jumped up in the grass and leaves, rushing into the depths of the forest without looking back. A cold voice with a hint of laughter spread through the forest. It seemed a little weak, but it was cold enough to make people tremble. Senior brotherly, we'll meet again. Jiang Shangyu. Li Tianlan tightly grasped the drop of silver liquid in his hand. His expression was calm, but his deep eyes became more and more indifferent. He took a deep breath and felt his current state. He clenched his fists but he did not chase after him. He was very clear about the power of Sky Strike. This horrible killing weapon developed by the Dongqing clan was enough to threaten most experts of the Thundershocking realm or even the peak of the Thundershocking realm at close range. This so-called close distance was roughly around 1500 meters. Just now, the Sky Strike had been completely pressed against Jiang Shangyu's chest. This was a zero-distance shot. But under such circumstances, Jiang Shangyu did not die. How could he not die? Li Tianlan lowered his head slightly and looked at the silver liquid in his hand. In less than a minute, the semi-solid liquid gradually solidified again. In his sight, the liquid, which was like a water droplet, vibrated slightly and finally became a solid metal ball the size of a soybean. Raindrops kept falling on Li Tianlan's hand. At this moment he did not know whether it was an illusion or something else, but he always felt that the dim metal ball in his hand seemed to be slightly brighter. What the hell is this? Li Tianlan frowned. There was no doubt that this belonged to Jiang Shangyu. There seemed to be a piece of alloy hidden in his chest. When the sky attack was pressed against Jiang Shangyu's chest, Li Tianlan noticed it, but he didn't pay much attention to it. With the power of the sky attack, there was basically no alloy that could not be destroyed. But it was obvious that the power of Sky Strike was almost completely offset by that piece of alloy. Most of Jiang Shangyu's injuries came from the fierce impact of Sky Strike. And this drop of silver liquid should be a drop that was separated from the piece of alloy in Jiang Shangyu's chest. Of course, it was just a drop that was not completely destroyed. Li Tianlan squeezed the small metal ball in his hand, and his face became a little gloomy. Boom, boom, boom. A series of explosions suddenly rang out in the distance. The roar came from afar as if there were artillery firing aimlessly. The whole forest was trembling slightly, and the leaves that had lost all their moisture after the battle fluttered and fell. Li Tianlan was stunned and looked back subconsciously. In the distance, at the spot where hundreds of East Island elites were ambushing, an unexpected fierce battle seemed to have broken out. The sound of artillery roared and the fire soared into the sky. Even though he was very far away, Li Tianlan could vaguely feel the smoke and hot air waves rising in the distance. Li Tianlan suddenly remembered what the man named Daybreak had just said. I was going to kill all the elites of East Island here. Isn't it exciting to think of slaughtering people? But there are already 3 guys who are not weak fighting over there. I came here in advance and happened to see this wonderful battle. Your sword move is good and that shot is not weak either. But you can't kill Nani Shio, so I can't be regarded as taking your military exploits. Well, besides, I saved your life. 3 guys who were not weak. Not weak. This didn't sound like a compliment, but such an evaluation came from the mouth of Daybreak, a superior a half-step to the invincible realm. They were at least 3 superiors at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. With the death of Nani Shio, this defense spot was obviously going to be wiped out under the surprise attack of 3 superiors at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. Li Tianlan struggled to stand up, took the sky attack, hesitated, and finally decided to leave. He wasn't sure who was attacking the East Island elites at this defense spot, but in his current state he wasn't even qualified to go up and watch. It was the best choice to leave here first. But this time he was alone again. That kind of quiet lurking life seemed to be over. Without Jiang Shangyu, how he, who was seriously injured, could hunt the enemies at other defense spots alone was also a problem that needed careful consideration. Li Tianlan took a deep breath, turned around and moved forward. Wait a minute. A footstep suddenly sounded from the forest. At first it was in English, but he soon realized something and repeated it in somewhat stiff Chinese. Li Tianlan turned around abruptly and subconsciously held the sky attack, which actually had no bullets, in his hand. 100 meters away, a sharp blue electric arc spread rapidly in the forest. A figure moved forward as if stepping on the electric light, as fast as the wind and lightning. Any trees in front of him were smashed into powder in the spread of the electric arc. Almost in the blink of an eye, the figure had appeared in front of Li Tianlan in the electric light. Li Tianlan simply gave up the idea of leaving. There was a big difference between superiors at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. The so-called peak was actually just a realm. After breaking through the stabilization phase of the thunder-shocking realm, it was the peak phase. But there was also a huge difference in combat effectiveness between those who had just entered the peak phase and those who were about to break through. Judging from the momentum, the strength of the person in front of him would at least not be lower than that of Nani Shio. Even if he was not a half-step to the invincible realm, he was not far from it. Such a person in Li Tianlan's current state could not run away. He stood quietly where he was, calmly looking at the figure that appeared in front of him in an instant. This was an extremely handsome Western white man about 30 years old. He was tall and burly, handsome, and had blonde hair. He wore a white suit which had been stained with a lot of blood. His smile was gentle, but his body still carried the fierce killing intent that had not dissipated. He looked elegant and dangerous. He looked at Li Tianlan's face seriously. After the battle, Li Tianlan's face was dirty, but it did not completely cover his appearance. The white man breathed a sigh of relief and said with a smile, "Is it Li Tianlan? Young Master Li? Young Master Li?" Li Tianlan had heard of this name, but he rarely heard it. He narrowed his eyes slightly, but his hand did not loosen his grip on the gun. "Let me introduce myself. I'm Duke, Madame Qin Weibai's most loyal servant." Duke looked at Li Tianlan with a smile on his face and sighed with emotion. "I finally found you. My God, you don't know how we got through these days. If you had an accident in East Island, the boss would have been furious. I'm afraid that none of us servants would have survived." Duke. Among the 12 super masters of Samsara, Duke ranked second only to Saint, military counselor, and general. Li Tianlan's eyes moved. He had never seen this supermaster of samsara before, so he did not dare to be careless. He just said calmly, "Why should I believe your identity? Isn't my loyalty enough?" Duke looked at Li Tianlan in surprise and said in a serious tone. The corner of Li Tianlan's mouth twitched. At this moment he could almost clearly hear the sound of something falling to the ground. That was the moral integrity of a supermaster. It fell to the ground and broke into pieces. "Tianlan, he is indeed Duke. After you lost contact we acted together. 10 hours ago we got in touch with Bai Yuming again and knew what you were going to do tonight. So we came here as soon as possible. Are you okay?" A faint tired voice sounded, steady and dignified. A tall and plump blonde woman walked out of the darkness and appeared in front of Li Tianlan. "Horsewoman." Li Tianlan finally breathed a sigh of relief, put down the sky attack in his hand and shook his head. "I'm okay. It's not a big problem." Horsewoman nodded and smiled. When she was about to say something, Duke suddenly said, "Young Master Li here?" He pointed at the empty and desolate battlefield nearby and said with a solemn expression, "Is this the place where you fought?" "Yes, I met Nani Xiao in Heavenly Calamity." Li Tianlan nodded. "Heavenly Calamity?" Duke's and Horsewoman's faces changed at the same time, and they subconsciously raised their voices. Li Tianlan's eyes narrowed slightly, and he suddenly had a better understanding of Heavenly Calamity, who was known as the Spear King. He mentioned Nani Xiao and Heavenly Calamity at the same time, but it was clear that Duke and Horsewoman's attention had been attracted by Heavenly Calamity. "It's Heavenly Calamity." Li Tianlan nodded. "But he ran away and Nani Xiao died." As he spoke he suddenly thought of something. He narrowed his eyes and asked, "By the way, do you know the code name Daybreak?" "Daybreak?" Duke was stunned and subconsciously looked at Horsewoman. Then he nodded. "I've only heard of this person recently. He seems to be a loyal confidant of a highness. I'm afraid he's no weaker than Saint. His strength seems to have surpassed the half-step invincible realm, and he's only one step away from the real invincible realm. This is a very mysterious force." Horsewoman said, "Samsara seems to be planning to cooperate with them recently. Saint is in charge of this matter." Mysterious. In Li Tianlan's impression, Samsara Palace seemed to be the most mysterious force in the dark world. And the force behind Daybreak, was it the kind of force that was so mysterious that it didn't even have a name? Saint. Well, Saint, Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes. He knew that Saint, the first supermaster of Samsara, was in East Island. If there was no accident, Saint should be with Shitian Mingzi and Dubian Xiangyuan now, and he had already got in touch with Shitian Financial Group. Then Shitian Financial Group? Li Tianlan asked subconsciously. "It's a bargaining chip." Duke said everything he knew. Perhaps only the core supermasters like them knew what the identity of Qin Weibai's man meant. Shitian Financial Group is the bargaining chip for the transaction between Samsara and the force behind Daybreak. Li Tianlan whistled subconsciously and said with a smile, "A large financial group as a bargaining chip. What a big deal." The sound of gunfire still sounded in the distance, but it was getting weaker and weaker. Li Tianlan glanced in that direction and raised his eyebrows slightly. "Who's there?" "It's flaming fire." The three of us acted together. Looking at Paladin, who wanted to say something, Paladin glared at him without batting an eyelid. Li Tianlan nodded and said, "Let's go and have a look." Horsewoman suddenly looked around and said in a strange tone, "Tianlan, I heard that Jiang Shangyu is with you. Where is he?" "He escaped." Li Tianlan was silent for 2 seconds and sighed. "I shot him. I thought I could kill him, but there was an accident." He reached out and handed the bean-sized metal ball in his hand to Horsewoman. "Do you know what this is?" Horsewoman subconsciously took it. Looking at the metal that had completely solidified into a round ball, she frowned slightly. Duke suddenly made a sound of surprise. He took the metal ball and looked at it carefully. Li Tianlan looked at Duke calmly. But Duke's face gradually became dignified. He quickly glanced at Li Tianlan, then lowered his head and stretched out a finger. A faint but bright electric arc appeared in his hand. The arc became brighter and brighter, gradually turning into a dazzling blue. Duke stretched out his finger and slowly pressed the arc on the metal ball in his palm. The metal ball surged slightly and seemed to be a little loose under the impact of the arc. But then it returned to its original state again, but the light was a little dimmer. "This is..." Duke's pupils shrank slightly. He glanced at Li Tianlan with a complicated look in his eyes. "This is a kind of metal." The Duke hesitated for a moment and said something insincerely. "Make it clear." Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes and said calmly, There was no curiosity or command in his voice, but there was an irresistible force in it. Duke smiled bitterly and looked at Li Tianlan. He hesitated and said, "I'm not sure what it is. I'm just guessing that it should be a metal that has lost part of its activity. But if there is no accident, the activity of this metal will slowly recover after a while." He looked at Li Tianlan cautiously. Li Tianlan remained calm. Horsewoman's face changed. A metal that could withstand the attack of a top expert of the thundershocking realm without losing part of its activity, and its activity could slowly recover. There seemed to be only one kind of metal like this in the whole dark world. "Go on." Li Tianlan looked at the silver in Duke's hand without changing his expression. Duke looked at Horsewoman and braced himself to say, "Young Master Li, do you know the 12 murderous weapons in the dark world?" Li Tianlan looked at Duke strangely and nodded without saying anything. "Actually," Duke took a deep breath and said softly, 20 years ago there were 13 murderous weapons in the dark world, but later one was broken. Among the 13 murderous weapons, only 2 have silver bodies. One belongs to the Jiang family of South America and is called the Legend of Qin. And the other is called the Infinite Sky. It used to belong to Zhuanyuantai of Kunlun, to the Li family." Li Tianlan's face suddenly changed. Duke looked at the metal ball in his hand and continued, "If I'm not mistaken, this little thing should be one of the fragments of the Infinite Sky. Speaking of updates, the recent updates are really F***ket up." Just now in the reader group, a brother said that he didn't want to see the updates, but wanted to see the reason why he stopped updating. But in fact, I can't even find a reason to stop updating. I'm just not in a good state. I have ideas and know how to write, but I just feel unsatisfied when I write. In fact, I feel that I can update twice or even 3 times every day. I think so when I stop updating, but when I write, it's F***king, a pain in the ass. Chapter 173. The rain fell between heaven and earth in the night and slowed down. The rainy days in Changdao that had lasted for many days seemed to be about to pass. The wind gradually became gentle and blew melodiously into the distance. As far as the eye could see, the fire gradually went out, and the sound of gunfire slowly disappeared. The quiet mountain forest was covered with the veil of night, extraordinarily quiet and serene. Li Tianlan stood quietly on the uneven ground after the fierce battle. He lowered his head and looked at the silver metal ball in his hand. The murderous weapon that once belonged to the Li family. The murderous weapon that was broken in the last battle of his father. In that battle, it was not only the infinite sky that had been shattered. The glory and splendor of the Li family for hundreds of years seemed to have been shattered along with this murderous weapon, turned into dust, particles, and turned into nothingness. Li Tianlan never knew that his family also had a murderous weapon that could dominate the dark world. But in some vague memories, it seemed that when he was very young, when the people in the camp at the border were still prosperous, his grandfather seemed to have sent many people to the border to look for something. Was this it? Looking at the bean-sized metal ball in his hand, Li Tianlan's eyes turned as deep as the deepest night sky. "You can understand it as for a woman. My most beloved woman. Do you know what Kunlun City is? Do you know what Phoenix Pavilion is? Why does it have nothing to do with a mortal enemy? Senior Brother Li, do you know how your father died back then? Among the 13 murderous weapons, only 2 have silver bodies. One belongs to the Jiang family of South America and is called the Legend of Qin. And the other is called the Infinite Sky. It used to belong to Zhuanyuantai of Kunlun, to the Li family." In the quiet mountain forest, some seemingly important or unimportant conversations immediately came into Li Tianlan's mind. Kunlun City, Phoenix Pavilion, the Li family, the Infinite Sky. Some things seemed to be vaguely related to each other, but some crucial things were missing from each other. No matter how he thought about it, something was wrong. What did Jiang Shangyu know? And how did the fragment of the Infinite Sky fall into Jiang Shangyu's hands? Li Tianlan was silent, carefully recalling the scene when the muzzle of the sky attack was pressed against Jiang Shangyu's chest. He felt that the fragment was at least the size of a palm. If they were all fragments of the Infinite Sky, how could Jiang Shangyu get so many? Jiang Shangyu. Jiang Shangyu. Li Tianlan clenched the silver metal ball in his hand and kept repeating the name. The bright light kept flashing in his pupils, which added a bit of enchanting charm to him. "Young Master Li, should I go after them?" He shouldn't have gone far. Duke looked at Li Tianlan and asked cautiously. Duke, who met Li Tianlan for the first time, didn't like or dislike him, but he knew very well what it meant when his boss asked him to come to East Island. The 12 supermasters of Samsara were the real core figures of Samsara Palace, But when the will of the master of Samsara Palace was silent, Qin Weibai's will was the highest instruction of the whole Samsara Palace. Duke naturally knew how to treat Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan's heart skipped a beat. After thinking about it, he shook his head and smiled. Forget it. He glanced at Duke and said calmly, "From now on, just call me by my name like horsewoman. I'll call you Duke." Duke nodded, but there seemed to be some confusion in his eyes. He didn't know why Li Tianlan didn't let him catch up. The intelligence system of Samsara Palace had always been a mystery to the outside world. What people had seen had always been the kind of almost all-pervasive and yet meticulous intelligence system that never existed. Of course, Samsara Palace knew Zhongzhou State very well. In terms of the younger generation, although Jiang Shangyu ranked second among the top 10 young experts, behind Wang Xingxiao and Gu Hanshan, Samsara Palace had a very high evaluation of Jiang Shangyu, even the highest. He was no weaker than Wang Xingxiao and Gu Hanshan at all. How far could such a person escape when he was seriously injured? If he caught up with him now, Duke had at least 50% confidence to kill Jiang Shangyu. This was equivalent to getting rid of a future enemy for Li Tianlan. Why not catch up with such a good opportunity? Your identities. Li Tianlan looked at Duke and shook his head. Not appropriate. Duke was stunned. He took a deep look at Li Tianlan and said nothing. Li Tianlan also wanted to kill Jiang Shangyu. Duke was an expert who was infinitely close to the half-step invincible realm. If he did it himself, the chance of success was quite high. But there was no impenetrable wall in the world. Although Samsara Palace had been cooperating with Zhongzhou State in recent years, partners and their own people were two different concepts. If Jiang Shangyu died in his hands, it could be regarded as dying in the battle for the Chosen One in Zhongzhou State. But if he died in the hands of Duke, the super master of Samsara, then things would become sensitive. Today the Jiang family occupied more than just a seat in the decision-making committee. Jiang Shangyu's father, Jiang Shan, could easily set off a big storm, no matter his position in the Prince Group or his relationship with the Special Warfare Group. If Jiang Shangyu died in the hands of Samsara Palace, the best result was that Samsara Palace would be in constant trouble. If it was more serious, the entire Samsara Palace would completely withdraw from Zhongzhou State, and it was even possible that it would be listed as a hostile force. There's nothing inappropriate about it. A cold and sweet voice came from the dark mountain forest. Although there are risks, there are some things that can't be guaranteed. It's definitely worth taking some risks to keep Jiang Shangyu here. Li Tianlan raised his eyebrows slightly and turned his head. The night rain had completely stopped. Flaming Fire's figure walked out of the wet and hazy night. She looked a little tired, but her eyes were amazingly bright. In the future, Jiang Shangyu is likely to be one of your most powerful enemies. It's a pity not to kill such a person. Duke looked at Flaming Fire and then at Li Tianlan, ready to make a move. Li Tianlan habitually narrowed his eyes. After a moment of silence, he shook his head. Forget it. He was silent for a while and finally shook his head. It had been about 10 minutes since Jiang Shangyu escaped. Li Tianlan was not sure whether the communication device on Jiang Shangyu was damaged or not. If it was not damaged, then at least Jiang Shangyu had informed his father Jiang Shan as soon as possible. If he went after him now, whether he succeeded or failed, it would be troublesome. Li Tianlan was not worried that Jiang Shangyu would spread the news that he had shot him. First of all, Jiang Shangyu wanted to kill him first. Second, whether it was the fragment of the infinite sky, the so-called Phoenix Pavilion, or Jiang Shangyu's heavenly king heart, they were all involved in the game of life and death between the two. At most, Jiang Shangyu would tell Jiang Shan. As long as he did not die, then at least the two sides could exchange for a superficial peace. Even if it was temporary, it was much better than the trouble he would face after killing Jiang Shangyu. The most important thing was time. Li Tianlan now needed at least 2 or 3 years to recover to his peak state. The inadaptability of forcibly upgrading to the fire-flaming realm with medicine and the temporary effect of the medicine made Li Tianlan crave to become stronger. If he had 3 or 5 years, he did not even need to reach the invincible realm. As long as he entered the thunder-shocking realm, he would not have so many considerations and scruples, and he would not have to compromise in the face of the general trend. Let's go. Li Tianlan carefully put away the fragment of the infinite sky, which represented the glory of the Li family, and turned to walk forward. Young Master Li, no Tianlan, I think what Jingxiang said is right. I'm willing to give it a try. It's a good thing to help you kill an enemy directly, isn't it? Duke walked beside Li Tianlan, a step behind him, and said with a chuckle. It had to be said that when this handsome supermaster of Samsara smiled, he gave people a very warm feeling. He had blonde hair and obvious smile lines. When he smiled, his whole handsome face seemed to show a kind of sincere joy, and it was so bright that it seemed to be able to dispel the darkness around him. Li Tianlan turned to look at him and suddenly asked, "Do you know who my biggest enemy is?" Duke's smile froze slightly, and then he instinctively pondered. It should be Wang Xingxiao? Well, he does deserve the title of Young Heavenly Son. He has such strength at such a young age. There is no second one in the dark world like him. With this kind of talent, he deserves the title of Heavenly Son. Li Tianlan smiled. In the past 200 years, the fastest expert to reach the thunder-shocking realm in Zhongzhou State and even in the dark world was 23 years old. This record came from Zhuanyuantai of Kunlun. It could be said that it was one of Li Tianlan's ancestors. Wang Xingxiao had never celebrated his 24th birthday. Compared with the legendary record, he was only a few months slower. Li Tianlan never denied this terrifying talent. After Wang Xingxiao, in the words of Zhongzhou State, it is probably Gu Hanshan and Jiang Shanyu. They may all become your biggest enemies. But although these people are also very strong, they are not as good as Wang Xingxiao. I'm not talking about strength and talent. It should be the foundation. It seems that people who come from the Wang family of Beihai will be looked up to on any occasion. Duke shook his head and sighed softly. There was some melancholy in his eyes for no reason. Li Tianlan didn't stop smiling. He shook his head and said in a flat tone, "No. No." Duke looked at Li Tianlan with a puzzled face. "My biggest enemy is time. And only time." Li Tianlan said blandly, "If it's about people, I have no enemies." He looked at the night ahead with a calm and resolute expression. His gentle tone revealed a kind of confidence that could make anyone awe. Not even one. The corner of Duke's mouth twitched. After a long silence, he shrugged and spread his hands, saying with a smile, "Well, I shouldn't have believed it. But I don't know why, after hearing it from you, I believe it. Jingxiang, horsewoman, do you believe it?" A strong killing intent rose behind him out of nowhere. Li Tianlan looked back in shock. Flaming Fire, who was quietly following him, squinted and stared at Duke, who had a playful smile on his face. Horsewoman looked helpless. Li Tianlan, who didn't know the situation, looked at Flaming Fire and asked subconsciously, "Your name is Jingxiang? I heard from Little Bai that you are from East Island." He looked at Duke and felt that something was wrong, but he couldn't tell what was wrong. The 12 super masters of Samsara were all code names. Duke could call Flaming Fire's real name intimately. They should have a good relationship, but... Kyoka Kitano. Tianlan, don't you know her? Duke blinked. His smile was still bright and handsome, but there was a trace of wretchedness in it. Looking at Li Tianlan's blank expression, Duke shook his head in disbelief and sighed. "My God, you really need to make up for it. There is someone who doesn't know Kyoka Kitano. She is my goddess, the most famous star in East Island today. Tianlan, I will show you Kitano's works later." Her latest work seems to be... Crazy Girl, Wife Investigator? You should see it really. In Flaming Fire's eyes, which were about to explode, Duke continued to talk excitedly. Flaming Fire's face is 70% similar to Kyoka Kitano's, but her temperament is colder. Well, I have observed her but... so beautiful. I face Flaming Fire every night. I know it's Kitano. Tianlan, do you want to touch it? Flaming Fire doesn't dare to refuse. Damn woman, do you want to fight me? The lightning, like extremely condensed thunderbolts, suddenly fell from the sky. Li Tianlan, who was standing next to Duke, was unscathed, but there was a big black hole where Duke had been standing. In the flashing lightning, Duke and Flaming Fire disappeared almost at the same time. The blue arc of light spread fiercely, and the forest dozens of meters away exploded into the sky in an instant. It's starting again. Horsewoman groaned helplessly. She looked at Li Tianlan and said with a wry smile, "Personal advice, Tianlan. You should stay away from that wretched bastard Duke. He seems to be interested in Flaming Fire, and me, our butts. This kind of thing has happened more than once." Duke's words came to Li Tianlan's mind for no reason. "Tianlan, do you want to touch it?" Flaming Fire doesn't dare to refuse. Ahem, and Horsewoman, Li Tianlan's eyes wandered. It was completely instinctive. Horsewoman's dignified and charming face suddenly blushed. She took a small step back subconsciously and stared at him with her beautiful eyes. "What are you looking at?" "Ahem," Li Tianlan coughed and looked away awkwardly, but 4 words were still echoing in his mind. "Don't dare to refuse." This "don't dare" was really exquisite. "Let's go." He took a deep breath, stepped forward and asked casually, "What's your next plan?" Let's gather people in Changdao first. Whether it's me, Duke, or Flaming Fire, we all have tasks in Changdao. But our main task is to keep you safe. So when we heard that you were missing, we all put down what we were doing. Now our team should break through to Changdao, and some of them have already entered Changdao. The most important thing now is to gather people. Horsewoman shrugged and said in a lazy tone. It's not easy. Li Tianlan frowned and said subconsciously. He was sure that some elites had already entered Changdao, but now many people on both sides had completely lost contact. Even Li Baidian and the others were missing. It might be quite difficult to gather these people, but it was something they had to do. It's okay. Horsewoman said softly, we've recently established a new cooperation channel in East Island, and now it comes in handy. A new cooperation channel? Li Tianlan glanced at Horsewoman, who still looked calm, and a figure came to his mind instinctively. Daybreak. Daybreak, who just appeared and saved his life. Samsara Palace seemed to be ready to cooperate with the force behind Daybreak by using Shitian Financial Group, which intended to seek refuge as a bargaining chip. Intuitively, Li Tianlan felt that this new cooperation channel had something to do with the force behind Daybreak. A mysterious force whose name he didn't even know? Could it be a big force hidden in East Island? Samsara was cooperating with the hidden dark force in East Island. Did the officials of East Island know about it? East Island and Zhongzhou State and Samsara and East Island. The success or failure of Zhongzhou State's plan probably depended on the result of the Battle of Changdao. A series of things should have gradually come to the surface, but a cloud of fog suddenly appeared in front of Li Tianlan's eyes. It covered the general trend and it was chaotic. In fact, I was inclined to kill Jiang Shangyu just now. Horsewoman suddenly said, but it's a little too late to say this now. We can only wait for the next chance. This time Jiang Shangyu is seriously injured and may leave East Island. It seems that only Wang Xingxiao and Gu Hanshan are left as candidates for that position. Which position? Li Tianlan looked back at Horsewoman. You don't know? The look in Horsewoman's eyes was strange. Li Tianlan frowned and shook his head. He didn't understand why Wang Xingxiao and Gu Hanshan, the heirs of the two super forces, would participate in this Zhongzhou state plan. It was reasonable for them to compete with each other for the country, but he felt it was a little abrupt. After all, even if they were competing, they wouldn't participate in such a big scene where they could die at any time. It was best to let them continue to grow. But now, with the so-called position that Horsewoman said, everything seemed to have a reasonable explanation. To be exact, it's a quarter of the leadership of a troop. This was originally a competition between Wang Xingxiao and Gu Hanshan, and the higher-ups also acquiesced. But Wang Xingxiao also had this idea, but now, Horsewoman shook her head and said, it's his bad luck to meet you. Which troop? Li Tianlan touched his nose, feeling a little baffled. The national treasure. Horsewoman looked at Li Tianlan and said faintly, the super troop of Zhongzhou State, similar to the Kusanagi force but more advanced. Chapter 174. It was noon and the sun was high in the sky. In the past week, the drizzle had washed away the dust in the air. Under the sunshine, the air in Changdao was unspeakably clean and fresh. The bright sunshine shone on the deep yard with mottled shadows of trees. The breeze blew the hair, the leaves and the shadows of the trees swayed. This was a large yard, deep and quiet, almost completely surrounded by all kinds of artificially planted trees and flowers. There was only one cobblestone path in the yard that could allow two people to walk side by side. The path zigzagged to the antique attic in the center of the yard. After spring, when everything came back to life, autumn hadn't arrived yet. The whole yard was lush and full of vitality. The fragrance of flowers. The fragrance of tea was spreading in the wind. In front of the milky white marble table, Li Tianlan quietly looked at the list in his hand and said without looking up, what does this mean? It means exactly what it means. Duke, who was wearing a very coquettish pink suit, sat opposite Li Tianlan with a bright smile. Within the Samsara Palace, the ranking among the super masters was extremely important. Although they were all super masters, the ranking often meant the status of each other. Among the 12 super masters of the Samsara Palace, 4 were in East Island. The first super master, Saint, was in charge of cooperating with a mysterious force and had never met Li Tianlan. Among Duke, Horsewoman and Flaming Fire, Duke ranked the highest. When something happened, he naturally took the lead. Horsewoman and Flaming Fire had a tacit understanding of this. So now he sat in front of Li Tianlan and gave him a document. Of course I know. Li Tianlan put the document on the table and pointed at it with his fingers. Then he subconsciously rubbed his forehead and said with a wry smile, "But I don't know what you mean by showing me this document." They were now in a secret club in the southwest of Changdao, and it could even be said to be the most high-end secret club. East Island had a high population density, but its territory was very small. Therefore, in the whole East Island, some racecourses, golf courses, clubs, and even villa areas that covered a large area were strictly approved. This kind of land-saving practice also promoted the unity and cohesion of the upper circle of East Island to some extent, which could be considered as killing two birds with one stone. But this kind of strict approval procedure was an exception in Changdao. This was the first city in the world to be bombed by nuclear weapons. It had been deserted for a long time. Many large areas of vacant land in Changdao were bought a long time ago. The club Li Tianlan was in now was one of them, and it belonged to a foreign company. It seemed to be backed by a famous European consortium and had a deep foundation in Changdao. This was also the place where the three supermasters of samsara hid with Li Tianlan. From the beginning to the end, the clubhouse had been specially assigned to receive them, and they also sent people to take care of their food and daily life in secret. All the waiters were European, and Li Tianlan and the others were not allowed to meet any East Island people in the clubhouse. According to the Duke, this place was absolutely safe. And Li Tianlan finally had the most comfortable sleep since he arrived in East Island. He slept for nearly 8 hours without worrying about Jiang Shangyu's plot or Mai Shiranui's pursuit. Li Tianlan even dreamed of Qin Weibai and Wang Yuetong. When the charming dream passed and the sun rose high in the sky, Li Tianlan, who had a comfortable sleep, saw Duke again and the information he handed over. This was an extremely complicated set of information, or rather, a list of names. It was a list that was so long that it made him dizzy. Duke said, "It's urgent." So Li Tianlan sat in front of the stone table and spent nearly 3 hours reading the list. He missed lunch and drank 4 or 5 cups of tea. Then he braced himself to finish reading the list. The list involved polar light, and many people didn't even have exact names. They only said that they belonged to a certain organization and a few people. Li Tianlan had seen many names on the list. Of course, most of them he had never seen before. Yi Fengqing, Gu Yunxia, Thunder God, Gu Yulan, Fan Haoyu, Du Hanin. Li Tianlan was familiar with these. There were also some messy organizations like the 6 members of the Flying Bird Special Warfare Group, the 13 members of the Black Hole Intelligence Department, and the 7 members of the 5th Bureau affiliated to Kunlun City. Li Tianlan had never heard of them. Li Tianlan braced himself to finish reading the list. He felt dizzy and numbly looked at the top of the list. There were only 4 words on the top. Snowdance Corps. Li Tianlan naturally knew about the Snowdance Corps. It was a corps set up for the plot of Zhongzhou State this time. In this respect, Li Tianlan was now a member of the Snowdance Corps. But this list? To some extent, you are now in control of the life and death of everyone on the list. Duke smiled and took a sip of tea. His tone was soft and soothing, and there seemed to be a strange brilliance in his eyes. Li Tianlan raised his eyebrows in surprise. Before he could speak, Duke had taken the initiative to explain, "There are about 2,000 people in the Snowdance Corps who entered East Island this time. And East Island reacted very fast this time, faster than everyone's expectation. So." Duke shrugged with a smile on his face. "They are all scattered now." Both Samsara and Zhongzhou State expected such a situation at the beginning, but they didn't expect that East Island's attack would be so fierce. Now East Island is in chaos, but the elites of Zhongzhou State are even more chaotic. Countless experts of East Island are chasing after the scattered teams. Some intelligence agencies of Zhongzhou State are almost uprooted. Now everyone is trying to break through the encirclement of Changdao. If there is no accident, among these 2,000 people, there will be no more than 200 elites of Zhongzhou State who can escape the chase and break through the defense nodes on the periphery of Changdao. Now the members of the Snowdance Corps in East Island, to be precise, are in a state of disunity. Li Tianlan stared at Duke seriously and attentively, waiting for him to continue. There are about 1,200 people on this list. Duke pointed to the list in Li Tianlan's hand and said calmly, "And they are the 1,200 people whose whereabouts are under our control." Li Tianlan's pupils shrank suddenly, but he didn't ask anything. Instead, he lowered his head subconsciously and glanced at the list again quickly. His face became a little gloomy and he slightly clenched his fists. His face, which had always been calm and almost indifferent, finally showed a trace of anxiety that he couldn't hide. On this list of people whose whereabouts were under Samsara's control, there were still no names of Li Beidian, Ning Qianqing, Yu Qingyan, and Dongqing Rushi. Li Tianlan felt a little agitated. He took out a cigarette and lit it. He took a deep breath and managed to suppress his thoughts. Then he said calmly, "Go on." Duke nodded and said, "Now there is a very interesting change in the situation. And obviously, Changdao has been regarded by the officials of East Island as the battlefield of the final battle." Li Tianlan nodded. Of course, he knew that East Island wouldn't tolerate the dark invasion of Zhongzhou State. The final battle was imperative. But this was East Island, and East Island had the final say on where the final battle would be held. Nearly 2,000 elites from different cities in East Island chased them all the way to Changdao. It sounded extremely difficult, but it was the special warfare system of East Island and the support from all sides that did it. To put it bluntly, everyone from Zhongzhou State who sneaked into East Island was basically under the control of East Island. The reason why they didn't kill them all was that East Island didn't plan to pay too much. This was the home field of East Island, but at the same time, a large number of their elites were trapped in Zhongzhou State. On the national level, these were the bargaining chips of both sides. And even if East Island was really determined to kill all the elites of Zhongzhou State, it wasn't their style to fight separately. The scattered elites of Zhongzhou State were looking for a group. Wasn't East Island the same? If the scattered forces of Zhongzhou State were 1, then the scattered forces of East Island would be 100. Now they couldn't wait to kill them all. If some masters of Zhongzhou State were to fight desperately, East Island would suffer heavy losses. If Zhongzhou State killed the elites trapped in Zhongzhou State in a rage, the special warfare system of East Island wouldn't be able to recover in at least a few decades. It would drag on slowly. They would hunt them down, but they wouldn't risk their lives. They would let a large number of elites of Zhongzhou State bleed slowly, but they wouldn't be desperate and fight desperately. When their strength was less and less and they arrived in Changdao exhausted, East Island would gather its forces and try its best to deal with the last group of elites of Zhongzhou State. At that time, it would be up to East Island to decide whether to kill them all or capture them alive to trade with Zhongzhou State. East Island chose Changdao as the final battlefield, and the elites of Zhongzhou State had no choice. Even the other superpowers in the Dark World who might enter East Island to participate in this feast had no choice. After all, this was the home field of East Island. They had to play wherever East Island said. This wasn't a rule, but the Battle of Changdao was a tacit understanding of the Dark World. Everything that happened in Changdao could be regarded as a conflict in the Dark World. If they left Changdao and wanted to play somewhere else, East Island wouldn't let a large number of superiors wreak havoc in its territory. Then everything would turn into a war, and East Island would be forced to take out its army and weapons of mass destruction at the same time. By then, no one would be able to afford to play. It was the easiest for all parties to control the general trend within the scope of the conflict in the Dark World and get the desired benefits. I know. Li Tianlan nodded. The eyes of the Dark World are all focused on Changdao now, right? The Battle of Changdao? Yes. Duke nodded. The Battle of Changdao, and now it has entered the final stage. He paused, suddenly smiled, and asked, "So, in the final stage, which high-level member of the Snowdance Corps has arrived in Changdao?" Li Tianlan froze. The high-level member of the Snowdance Corps in Changdao? Several names flashed through his mind in an instant. Tribulation was still in Dongdu. Bai Yuming and Yi Fengqing were together, and now they were in Juban. Gu Yunxia had entered Wakayama. Thunder God appeared in Gangshan. The enchantress was looking for Wang Xingxiao. In this way, none of the thunder-shocking realm experts belonging to Zhongzhou State had arrived in Changdao at this time. What did this mean? In terms of cooperation, there are still high-level members with decision-making power. Duke chuckled and said, "The Snowdance Corps was established in a hurry, and the internal organization is still messy. In addition, we cooperate with Samsara, so the internal duties are not clearly divided for the time being. We are partners of Zhongzhou State, so I, Horsewoman, and Flaming Fire all have decision-making power." So, Li Tianlan's heart pounded. So, the situation has changed now. You see, now Zhongzhou State has obviously lost control of all the elites, and their intelligence channels have been uprooted. Even the high-level members of Zhongzhou State don't know where a large number of their elites are. But Zhongzhou State doesn't know, but Samsara does. The two sides conspire against East Island, which is cooperation. But if they use their own channels to help Zhongzhou State pick up their elites at the risk of exposure, this is not cooperation. Duke spread out his hands and laughed very happily. So, Li Tianlan took a hard drag on the cigarette, put it out, and said calmly, "Do you decide to stand by and do nothing about the people on the list?" "We haven't decided yet." Duke looked at Li Tianlan with a strange look in his eyes. He stared at Li Tianlan for a long time, then shook his head slightly and said with a smile, "We are waiting for your decision now. You are an ordinary member of the Snowdance Corps, but in Samsara here you have the highest decision-making power." He looked at Li Tianlan with a complicated look in his eyes and chuckled. "Tianlan, although your face is not too white, I have to say that you are the most enviable gigolo now. I'm not belittling you, I'm envious. Pure envious." Li Tianlan instantly understood what Duke meant when he said that he controlled the life and death of all the people on the list. Whether to save or not to save the more than 1,000 people on the list was now decided by him. Li Tianlan felt a little ridiculous. He looked at the list in his hand, which was not detailed but extremely rare, and said sincerely, "The intelligence system of Samsara really makes people speechless. This is not our channel." Duke was stunned and said frankly, "Our power in East Island is relatively weak, otherwise we would not have dragged Zhongzhou State to East Island. These intelligence channels belong to our allies. It's the mysterious force behind Daybreak." Li Tianlan couldn't help asking, "What kind of force is that? You don't even know its name, do you?" "God knows what their name is. Maybe they haven't thought about it yet." Duke said indifferently, "But this list is not fake. The cooperation between the two sides is very sincere this time. If you want to save people, it's our allies who will pick up the elites of Zhongzhou State. At worst, we can bring back at least 2/3 of the 1,200 people intact." A force that hadn't even thought about its name? Was it newly established? Or, Li Tianlan felt a headache and even more ridiculous. He shook his head randomly and said subconsciously, "Of course, don't rush to speak." Duke stood up with a smile and patted Li Tianlan on the shoulder. "You should think about it. Or you should talk to Zhongzhou State, shouldn't you?" "Talk?" Li Tianlan's heart suddenly shook. He suddenly stood up and looked at Duke. The Duke had a deep smile on his face. A light breeze blew through his hair, and his long golden hair fluttered like the waves of the sea. Li Tianlan didn't want to ask what to talk about. The fate of thousands or even more elites of Zhongzhou State was now in his hands. What to talk to Zhongzhou State about? Of course, to talk about conditions. Li Tianlan could almost clearly see a huge opportunity in front of him. If he made good use of this negotiation, it might be the biggest cornerstone of his rise. Of course, the premise was that he couldn't arouse the disgust of the big shots of Zhongzhou State. To put it simply, he couldn't be too greedy. What did he ask Zhongzhou State for? What could he get? And even if he couldn't get anything, those people he was about to save would undoubtedly owe him a great favor. This was almost a human network map drawn by the general trend. It was at his fingertips. Priceless treasure. But, is this really appropriate? Li Tianlan looked at Duke. If Her Highness Palace Master talks to Zhongzhou State in person, maybe she can get a lot of things that are beneficial to Samsara. In other words, these more than 1,000 people are your bargaining chips. Why give them to me? What did Palace Master say? Palace Master is silent. The Duke shrugged again. Li Tianlan smiled bitterly. In Samsara, when the master of Samsara Palace was silent, Qin Weibai's will was supreme. Boss said to help you at all costs. This is a good opportunity, isn't it? Duke said calmly, Palace Master used the 24 moves of sword, the unique skill of your Li family in the battle with Gu Xingyun. Your identity can't be kept secret for long. At this time, having so many elites owe you a favor may become one of your powerful bargaining chips to save your life. He reached into his arms and took out a slightly smaller but extremely detailed document. After talking to Zhongzhou State, you should talk to the Wang family of Beihai. Li Tianlan's mouth twitched and he subconsciously took the document. Let's go, it's time to eat. Duke glanced at Li Tianlan with a smile. I thought you would refuse this deal, and I was even ready to persuade you. Aren't all gentlemen like this? Li Tianlan twitched the corner of his mouth and said lightly, I'm not a gentleman. But you, or you supermasters, don't you have any objection to Little Bai's approach? Why should I have any objection? Duke said lightly, I listened to Palace Master, and Palace Master asked me to listen to my boss. That's it. Since I joined Samsara 5 years ago, it has been like this. Li Tianlan shook his head with a bitter smile. Suddenly, he froze and said subconsciously, You said you joined Samsara 5 years ago? Yes. Chapter 175. In less than a month, Zhuang Huayang was obviously much older and haggard. On the screen, the old principal still looked as refined and gentle as a middle-aged scholar, but the fatigue in his eyes could not be hidden. His skin, which used to be rather tight, was gradually relaxing and wrinkles had increased. After not seeing him for a short period of time, Zhuang Huayang seemed to have aged by 10 years. Although he looked haggard, it could be seen that the old headmaster was in a good mood. At least his smile wasn't fake. As soon as he saw Li Tianlan through the screen, he chuckled and said, "Boy, is everything going well in Changdao?" "Not bad." Li Tianlan responded casually, but he was thinking about the list he just saw in his mind. The negotiation with Zhongzhou State couldn't be delayed. The sooner the better. Li Tianlan knew what to do without Duke's reminder. From the time Li Tianlan sorted out the information to the time he finished reading, the latest was 16 hours ago, and the shortest was 6 hours. It wasn't a long time. But now almost all the elites of Zhongzhou State were facing the pursuit of the special warfare system of East Island. It was a veritable speed of life and death. A few hours was enough for too many variables to happen. And even if this was not mentioned, judging from the overall trend, there wouldn't be much time left for Li Tianlan. Nearly 2,000 elites of Zhongzhou State were breaking out of the encirclement of Changdao from all over East Island. So far, although everyone was still running away from the pursuit, they inevitably got close to Changdao. Even in the worst case, they had at most one more week and this pursuit would end. The Zhongzhou State elites who were being chased would either enter Changdao and wait for the final battle, or die on the road. Li Tianlan couldn't afford to delay at all. So he didn't even have lunch and went straight to Zhuang Huayang with the list. "Something on your mind?" Zhuang Huayang looked at Li Tianlan and raised his eyebrows slightly. Seeing that Li Tianlan still didn't want to speak, he sighed slightly and said, "You're stressed, aren't you? I know your current situation. For now you're all scattered and you've lost contact with many people." The muscles at the corners of his eyes twitched. Intentionally or unintentionally, he said, "There's still no news about Qin Ku, right? Generally speaking, it would be good if all the 2,000 elites of Zhongzhou State survived. But among these 2,000 people, the teachers, students, and even his granddaughter, Qin Ku, were naturally the most important. But according to the news from East Island, Qin Ku was one of the first batch of people who lost contact, and there was still no news about her. This had even become the thing that worried Zhuang Huayang the most now. "Yes." Li Tianlan looked up at Zhuang Huayang and said in a calm tone. On the screen, Zhuang Huayang's pupils suddenly condensed, and his sharp eyes seemed to look directly into Li Tianlan's eyes through the screen. "It's not just Mr. Qin. I have news about many other people," Li Tianlan said calmly. Just now he was still thinking about how to say the news euphemistically, so that when the higher-ups of Zhongzhou State might support him to a certain extent, he would not make them dislike him. However, this kind of thing didn't seem to be his forte at all. No matter how he thought about it, he still couldn't find the right words. A deal was a deal. No matter how nice it sounded, the essence would not change after all. When the higher-ups of Zhongzhou State were burning with anxiety about the 2,000 elites who sneaked into East Island, Li Tianlan traded their safety for his own interests. This was the essence and it could not be changed. So Li Tianlan simply said that although he was the heir of the Li family, he could now be regarded as a member of the academics, and he had no conflict with Zhuang Huayang. If he let the academics handle this matter, he would get some benefits at most, but in general it was worth it. "I'm now with Duke, Horsewoman, and Flaming Fire," Li Tianlan said slowly. "Simply put, I have mastered the channel of samsara. At present, samsara can know the whereabouts of about 1,200 elites, and it also has the strength to send people to meet them. For example, Yi Fengqing, Mr. Qin Ku, Gu Yunxia, Gu Yulan, 3i. Zhuang Huayang stood up uncontrollably. In addition to the extreme shock in his eyes, there was only a touch of faint uneasiness. He was not surprised that Li Tianlan was with the 3 super masters of samsara. Based on Qin Weibai's attitude toward this guy and her attitude that she even wanted to give up her soul, the biggest task of the 3 super masters was probably to protect Li Tianlan, even if they had to give up all other tasks. What he was shocked about was samsara's intelligence channel. In just a few days they could know the whereabouts of more than 1,000 elites in the whole East Island. How much power did they need to use? How much manpower and resources did they need to use? The key was that this power seemed to have not been discovered by East Island yet. Samsara Palace. How could this superpower in the dark world with a short history have such powerful power? This power might not be able to overthrow East Island, but it was enough to suppress any force except the East Island officials. Any force. Vaguely, Zhuang Huayang keenly sensed that there seemed to be something wrong with the cooperation with Samsara this time, but he couldn't tell what was wrong. The master of Samsara Palace was in Zhongzhou State. Qin Weibai was in Zhongzhou State. Li Tianlan also belonged to Zhongzhou State. Everything seemed to be fine, but when he thought of the horrible power of Samsara in East Island, Zhuang Huayang felt more and more like he was asking a tiger for its skin. This time, the plot of Zhongzhou State with the whole nation's power, was it a blessing or a curse? These people, Zhuang Huayang's eyes were solemn. Is Samsara Palace sure that they can get them to Changdao? At least 80%. Li Tianlan's tone was calm. Zhuang Huayang's heart sank again. At least 80%. This power was almost beyond everyone's imagination. Headmaster, I really need this opportunity. When Zhuang Huayang was still thinking, Li Tianlan suddenly said in a serious tone. What did you say? Zhuang Huayang subconsciously glanced at Li Tianlan. I have the list in my hand in the channel of samsara. This is an opportunity. I have to fight for something for myself. If you don't think I'm greedy, I want to ask you to help me. Li Tianlan's tone was getting calmer, but his eyes were shining with determination. Just now, he had seriously thought about the resources he had. At a glance, his resources were simply suffocatingly abundant. But when he thought about it carefully, the result was hard to make him happy. Now it seemed that his most stable and supportive resource was undoubtedly Samsara Palace. Qin Weibai was his woman. The master of Samsara Palace seemed to have some inexplicable relationship with the Li family. Samsara Palace was enough to be his strongest backer. But the most embarrassing thing was that Samsara Palace was a foreign force. They had no foundation in Zhongzhou State, and the Wang family of Beihai and Kunlun City would not allow this behemoth to develop in Zhongzhou State. If Li Tianlan was abroad in the future, everything might be smooth. But inside Zhongzhou State, the help that Samsara Palace could provide him was relatively limited and hidden. Of course, it was a matter of life and death. The master of Samsara Palace might still take action, but she could not be Li Tianlan's personal fighter, and Li Tianlan was not qualified. He went straight to Mount Dibbing. He challenged Gu Xingyun. The master of Samsara Palace had made her attitude toward him clear and declared force. When he returned to Zhongzhou State in the future, even if his identity was exposed, Wang Tianzong and Gu Xingyun would not do anything to him on the surface before they had full confidence to resist the revenge of Samsara Palace. But they could do something in the dark. Li Tianlan was not strong enough to be invincible under the invincible realm, and his foundation was extremely weak. In short, Kunlun City could find hundreds of ways to bypass Samsara Palace to attack Li Tianlan and make it difficult for the master of Samsara Palace to show up. When foreign forces couldn't enter Zhongzhou State, the master of Samsara Palace was the most powerful and the ultimate deterrent. And if Kunlun City really took action at all costs, Samsara Palace would retaliate crazily, and Zhongzhou State's attitude would be different. One was its own state-protecting war god, and the other was a foreign dark magnate. It was easy to tell who was close and who was distant. So in general, Samsara Palace could help Li Tianlan, but at most, it could protect him from being killed so easily. As for the academics, the two sides were purely cooperating, which meant that there was a possibility of falling out. There was even no need to fall out. As long as Li Tianlan was alive, the academics could protect him. But if Li Tianlan was killed, the academics would never have any conflict with the Special Warfare Group because of a dead person. Dongqing clan. Li Tianlan now held the only sky attack of the Dongqing clan, but he never dared to regard this super wealthy family as one of his own. Dongqing Rushi was a problem. Before he figured out how to deal with Dongqing Rushi, Li Tianlan didn't even dare to think about whether he would be a friend or a foe of the Dongqing clan in the future. So after thinking about it, Sai City could give Li Tianlan the most powerful support. But the power of Sai City was also far inferior to that of Kunlun City and the Wang family of Beihai. Sai City and the Samsara Palace cooperated internally and externally, which could give Li Tianlan a chance to develop without being killed easily. But how to develop, in fact, depended on himself to a large extent. His foundation was the East Emperor Palace, a foundation that only belonged to him. Li Tianlan now had a backer, but he didn't dare to completely rely on the force behind him. He just wanted the East Emperor Palace to rise as fast as possible. The faster the better. Even if the East Emperor Palace became the only throne in the Dark World in the next second, it would be better. The support of more than 1,000 people in exchange. And if he made good use of this great favor and network, when the plot of Zhongzhou State was over, the East Emperor Palace might have a solid foundation that could really take root in Zhongzhou State. What do you want? Zhuang Huayang narrowed his eyes and looked at Li Tianlan. His tone was extremely solemn. After all, what would happen to the samsara in the future was still his imagination. But Li Tianlan could now be regarded as one of his own. His potential and origin were worthy of the academic's strong investment. This was the first time that Li Tianlan made a request to the academics, and he brought a big gift. The academics had no reason to refuse. 10 people. Li Tianlan's tone was resolute. I want to bring 10 soldiers from the border, and the academics will be responsible for their safety. 10 people. Zhuang Huayang's face changed dramatically, and he even smiled bitterly. This is absolutely impossible. 10 soldiers. How could Li Tianlan say that? It was shameless to the extreme. In terms of military rank. Many people in the Li family in the border camp were indeed just soldiers. But in terms of strength, many of them were real generals, and they were generals with real power. In recent years, the Li family's talents had withered. Now it was said that in addition to Li Honghe, an expert of the invincible realm, there was not even a half-step invincible realm expert. But the remaining more than 100 people were the elites of the elites. Zhuang Huayang was really not surprised to find 10 thunder-shocking realm experts from these people. 10 thunder-shocking realm experts. Not to mention whether the academics were willing or not, this kind of thing that needed to be discussed at the plenary meeting of the decision-making committee. Once it was submitted, he was afraid that Kunlun City and the Prince Group would desperately stop it. The possibility of success is too low. Unless Gu Xingyun is crazy, he will not agree. Zhuang Huayang shook his head. You and I both understand what it means to be responsible for their safety. This kind of thing has to go through Kunlun City, and Gu Xingyun has a lot of decision-making power. It was naturally easy to take 10 people out of the border. But being responsible for their safety did not mean that they could not die. At least, they should be arranged with a suitable official position as protective clothes. If these experts came out, they would be put in the special warfare system. If Kunlun City did not agree, the academics had no good way to deal with it. There are too many people. Zhuang Huayang continued, unless your father's treason case really has nothing to do with Kunlun City, Gu Xingyun will never let these people out. There will always be a way. Li Tianlan looked at Zhuang Huayang and said quietly. Wei. Zhuang Huayang muttered to himself and said in a low voice, do you have any powerful bargaining chips? For example, Gu Hanshan. Li Tianlan fell silent. He paid special attention to the information about Gu Hanshan, but obviously, there was no information about Gu Hanshan on the list for the time being. Not yet. Li Tianlan shook his head. At present, I only have information about Wang Xingxiao. Zhuang Huayang's eyes suddenly lit up. So you are going to talk to Wang Tianzong again? If the Southeast Group and the academics join hands. Before he could finish his words, Li Tianlan interrupted him directly. No, I'm not going to talk to Wang Tianzong. Chapter 176. Li Tianlan was waiting for the news. It seemed that the only thing he could do now was to wait. In this general trend that swept the entire dark world and was about to break out in Changdao, there were plans between countries, fights between dark superpowers, frequent appearances of experts, and the shadows of invincible realm experts were getting more and more obvious. So far it was almost out of everyone's control. Li Tianlan couldn't control the general trend. He was just the most ordinary participant, a participant with his own purpose. He was waiting for the Battle of Changdao to break out. He was waiting for the result from Zhongzhou State. He was even waiting for the news from Li Beidian and others. The more depressed he was, the calmer he was. In the spacious study, the curtains had been completely drawn, and the thick sunshade blocked the bright sunshine outside the window. There was no light in the room, and the thick darkness filled every corner of the room. Li Tianlan sat alone on the sofa. Waiting. He could only wait. He could feel the restlessness and unwillingness in his heart more and more clearly. Perhaps he was unprecedentedly small in front of the general trend. The smaller he was, the more Li Tianlan desired to be strong. To lead the general trend, to turn the clouds and rain, and to cover the sky with one hand. That desire was so strong that he was unwilling to be dominated and unwilling to be a pawn. During the few months he entered the human world, his mentality seemed to be changing every moment. Only his ambition was getting stronger and stronger. The darkness covered Li Tianlan's expression, as well as the wildfire-like craziness and heat in his eyes. A slightly dazzling light came in from outside the door. Li Tianlan subconsciously narrowed his eyes and looked outside the door. Duke's tall figure stood in the bright sunshine outside the door, smiling like the wind. The talk didn't go well? He paused at the door, walked into the room and didn't choose to turn on the light after hesitating. The room was once again plunged into darkness. I don't know yet. I'm waiting for the result. Li Tianlan rubbed his forehead tiredly, thinking about his conversation with Zhuang Huayang just now. In fact, it was not difficult to bring 10 border soldiers to Huading, and he didn't need to ask anyone. But for the sake of safety he had to arrange a job for them that could protect themselves at least so that Kunlun City couldn't kill them easily. That was the most difficult thing. The academics was the ruling group today, but the academics was a rising force in Zhongzhou state. Most of them were ordinary political figures who did not have prominent backgrounds. It was only with the success of their leader, President Li Huaqing, that they became what they are today. At present, the academic strength in the special warfare system of Zhongzhou state was extremely weak. As for the military, although they occupied the highest leadership positions, they were not superior in terms of strength and were even slightly weaker. Both the Prince Group and the Wang family of Beihai had deep-rooted influence in the military. Li Tianlan wanted to bring 10 people from the Li family to Huading, which meant he had to ask the academics for 10 positions in the special warfare group or the military, and they were not low positions. Even if the academy was willing to help him, it would not be easy. Fortunately, Li Tianlan had enough chips in his hand. This opportunity was what he needed, but wasn't it what the academics needed? The first term of the academics in power was about to expire, and they also needed a certain opportunity to enhance their strength. However, such a game tested the political wisdom of the big shots. Li Tianlan was not qualified to participate in it, so he chose to give the chips to the academics. As for the final result, he would soon get a clear result. I asked for 10 experts from the Li consortium to be transferred from the border and given them security. Do you think there's a possibility of success? Li Tianlan suddenly asked. In the dark, neither of them could see each other's expressions, but their tones were extremely calm. Very smart. Duke commented subconsciously with a smile in his tone. At this stage, money and power were not the most important things for Li Tianlan. The most important thing was the foundation and the influence. If these 10 experts could come out from the border and be given positions by Zhongzhou state again, then at least in Huading, Li Tianlan's foundation would not be weak. Duke could vaguely feel Li Tianlan's inner restlessness, but it was clear that Li Tianlan was still calm and rational, and he did not let it get to his head. But 10 people should be a bit too many. Duke thought for a while and said, during this time the academics should get some positions to prepare for the change in 2 years. These are all positions that they snatched from other groups bit by bit. Give 10 to the Li consortium? He shook his head subconsciously, obviously not optimistic about the result this time. 5 at most. He was silent for a while and then he said with certainty. Li Tianlan was silent for a while and didn't say more about this topic. He just ordered calmly, arrange to meet Wang Shengxiao. In any case, make sure that he arrives in Changdao safely. Duke's eyes lit up slightly. Have you talked to the Wang family of Beihai? Not anymore. Li Tianlan's tone was calm. There's nothing to talk about. The Wang family of Beihai is not Zhongzhou state. In the dark, the two were silent for a while. After about a minute, Duke's voice continued to ring. Okay, I'll arrange it right away. In the dark, he stood up and walked out of the door. They could hear each other's voices, but they couldn't see each other's expressions. They knew each other, but they didn't know each other. The room became dark again. The big screen hanging on the wall lit up silently, and then a video communication from Zhongzhou state came over. Li Tianlan, who had just lit a cigarette, slightly shook his body and immediately answered the call. On the big screen, Zhuang Huayang's tired face appeared. In the dark, Li Tianlan's face turned into a strange livid color under the light of the screen, looking deep and cold. The two looked at each other slightly. 3 people. Zhuang Huayang said slowly, Tianlan, I just talked to the chief on the phone. In principle he agrees with your request, but 10 people are too many. 3 people is the limit we can strive for. Not the 5 people that Duke expected. Only 3 people. Li Tianlan frowned slightly. The number was far from what he had expected. Don't frown so soon. Zhuang Huayang smiled. Although there are only 3 people, the chief also has a surprise for you. You may not know, but just a few days ago the chief went to the border in person and met Senior Li. Li Tianlan suddenly looked up and looked at Zhuang Huayang with burning eyes. What did the chief say to my grandfather? Li Tianlan asked in a hoarse voice. I don't know the details, but the chief brought back a man from the border, named Li Wangsheng. Zhuang Huayang's tone revealed a little smile. You should know him, right? This person isn't one of the 3 people you've chosen. In addition, Old Yu has been silent for so many years, so he should have a position. The chief wants him to go to the Eastern Theater of Operations. I don't know the specific position, but it should not be too low. That makes 5 people, right? Yu Donglai went to the Eastern Theater of Operations. Li's village could send 3 people. And Li Wangxing, A smile gradually appeared on Li Tianlan's face. Of course he knew Li Wangxing, a brother who grew up with him. In Li Tianlan's original plan, no matter how many people he could bring back from the border, Li Wangxing must be one of them. He was a genius in the true sense. Although he did not have the wind and thunder veins, the heavenly king heart, and the exquisite bone, what he had been exposed to since he was a child were the core unique skills of the Li family. Moreover, he was extremely strong-willed. Most importantly, the appearance of Li Wangxing meant that he really had a confidant beside him besides Qin Weibai who he could trust without reservation. This feeling was very warm and exciting. Thank the chief for me. Li Tianlan looked at Zhuang Huayang and said calmly. We're on the same side. No need to be so polite. But the chief likes Li Wangxing very much. As for his arrangement, well, let's talk about it when you come back. Zhuang Huayang shook his head, and then his face became solemn. Comrade Tianlan, Zhongzhou State asks you to use the channel of Samsara right now and bring all our elites to Changdao. You have a week at most. The higher-ups don't have a clear order for your rescue operation, but they ask you to protect the lives of our people as much as possible. Can you do that? Li Tianlan felt a little weird, but in such an atmosphere he subconsciously straightened up, gave a military salute and said loudly, yes. Besides, I have news for you. Zhuang Huayang smiled and waved his hand, motioning Li Tianlan to relax. The second group of people of the Snowdance Corps will arrive in Changdao in a few days. Since you have the channel, how about you arrange their accommodation? He paused and then said with a bitter smile, after all, some of our strongholds in East Island of Zhongzhou State are almost destroyed. No problem. Li Tianlan nodded. This kind of reception seemed simple, but in fact it was also a favor. When the Snowdance Corps entered East Island, the first group leader was Tribulation. How could the second group leader be weak? Receiving such a person was also good for building his network. Li Tianlan had no reason to refuse. Headmaster, who is leading the team this time? Li Tianlan asked casually, intending to know in advance. Which group does he belong to? Zhuang Huayang's face froze. He hesitated, shook his head and said, he doesn't belong to any group. He is only responsible for the overall situation of Zhongzhou State. He is a real neutral figure. And this person has now been officially appointed as the first deputy commander of the Snowdance Corps. He will take over Tribulation's position and control all the elites of Zhongzhou State in East Island. A neutral figure? Li Tianlan became more and more curious. In the action of the Dark World where strength was respected, a neutral figure could take over Tribulation's position. What was his strength? An invincible realm expert? Are there any hidden invincible realm experts in Zhongzhou State? No. Zhuang Huayang shook his head. He hasn't reached the invincible realm yet, but he is recognized as the first person under the invincible realm in the Dark World. Don't be unconvinced. I know that Tribulation is also very strong. In terms of strength he may not be weaker than him, but Tribulation still lacks some achievements. This person seriously injured an invincible realm expert on the Holy List 3 years ago. With such achievements and such a title, he deserves it. He was not an invincible realm expert, but he seriously injured a real invincible realm expert. Li Tianlan's eyes flickered and shone brightly. Who is this person? One of the 4 spirits of Zhongzhou State, General of 9 Heavens Gong Sun Qi, codenamed Azure Dragon. Zhuang Huayang said indifferently, he is one of the 4 captains of the Terracotta Army of Zhongzhou State, and he is the first captain. The 4 spirits of Zhongzhou State? Li Tianlan raised his eyebrows in surprise. He knew the 4 gods of Zhongzhou State, but he had never heard of the 4 spirits. But he heard Horsewoman talk about the Terracotta Army. Wang Xingxiao, Gu Hanshan, and even Jiang Shangyu seemed to be fighting for a quarter of the leadership of the Terracotta Army. The reputation of the 4 spirits is naturally not as good as that of the 4 gods of Zhongzhou State. This title refers to the 4 captains of the Terracotta Army, Azure Dragon, White Tiger, Vermilion Bird, and Black Tortoise. To some extent, they are all real neutral figures. They are... Knock, knock, knock. Before Zhuang Huayang finished speaking, there was a sudden knock on the door. Come in. Li Tianlan said casually. The door was pushed open from the outside. Horsewoman's plump and charming figure stood quietly outside the door. She glanced at Zhuang Huayang on the screen, shrugged slightly and said with a smile, sorry. But I have a piece of news here which should be the most important thing to you. She paused and continued, we have got the whereabouts of Li Baidian and the others. Li Tianlan suddenly turned around and strode to the door without hesitation. Where are they? Chapter 177. In this war, if there was anyone that Li Tianlan cared about, it was undoubtedly the backbone members of the East Emperor Palace. The grinning Li Baidian and the taciturn Ning Qianqing were not bad friends, but true friends who could be brothers for life and death. It was their luck that the three of them met each other. Li Tianlan had no way to deal with them before, but now he had the exact information. No matter what, Li Tianlan had to bring them back. There was also Yu Qingyan. Starting from Yu Donglai, Yu Shi had really dedicated everything to the Li family. If something happened to Yu Qingyan in East Island, Li Tianlan really dared not imagine how big a blow it would be to Yu Donglai. Dongqing Rushi was his nominal fiancé. No matter what would happen to the engagement with the Dongqing clan, at least the Dongqing clan gave him real support. Because of this, Li Tianlan had to protect the second miss of the Dongqing clan. Where are they? Maybe because he stayed in the dark for too long, the soft light outside made Li Tianlan feel a little dazzling. He raised his hand to block it and asked calmly, "Zhongjing." Horsewoman glanced at Li Tianlan, her beautiful and dignified eyebrows slightly frowned, and said slowly, "About an hour ago, our partners got the news that they have been in Zhongjing recently." They have been in Zhongjing? Li Tianlan was a little surprised. Zhongjing was about 400 kilometers away from Changdao. Judging from the current situation, Zhongjing could be regarded as the rear of East Island. Because according to the information he got, a large number of elites of Zhongzhou state broke through the encirclement at the slowest to Ninghu. Li Baidian and the others, why didn't they break through? They are not weak. Li Tianlan whispered to himself. There were 6 people in Li Baidian's group. 2 were from Mount Shu, and 3 were from Jade Pool. Yu Qingyan was weak, but her poison was unparalleled on the battlefield. Although there were no Thundershocking Realm experts in this group, ordinary Thundershocking Realm experts could not stop them. Someone must have deliberately kept them in Zhongjing. In other words, they were trapped. Horsewoman thought about the information she got. After a short hesitation, she decided to tell the truth. At least an hour ago they were still being chased. Led by 2 experts at the peak of the Thundershocking Realm, there were nearly 100 experts and elites in other realms. The situation was very dangerous. She spoke carefully and observed Li Tianlan's expression at the same time. No worries. There was no anger. There was no irritation. What Li Tianlan exuded was complete calmness and rationality that bordered on cruelty. Can you provide support? He lit a cigarette and took a deep drag. He suddenly asked. This? The knight hesitated and smiled bitterly. Zhongjing is the base camp of Limitless Palace. It is also one of the few cities that our partners are unable to infiltrate. All these years there is only one dark force in Zhongjing, and that is Limitless Palace. Its existence is the only one. Our partner only has a small number of intelligence investigators in Chukyo, and most of them have no combat power. Li Tianlan spat out the smoke in his mouth, nodded, and said without hesitation, "Prepare the car. Now to Zhongjing." "You're going in person?" The knight froze for a moment. Li Tianlan had already turned around and strode out of the villa. "You and Duke come with me. Flaming fire stays." Now he didn't want to waste a second. Before he finished speaking, he had already walked down the stairs of the villa and went straight to the lush courtyard outside the villa. He was swift and decisive. In less than 10 minutes, a high-powered car directly left the courtyard and entered the area of the club where they were hiding. Finally, it went down the mountain from the back door of the club and went straight to Zhongjing. In the back seat of the car, Li Tianlan smoked silently and said nothing. "I still object to you taking the risk yourself." Duke drove himself. In the roar of the engine, he drove faster and faster, and his face became serious. "This is very likely to be a trap." Duke said, "Everyone else is breaking out of the encirclement. There is no reason for East Island to trap a team that has strength but can't affect the overall situation in East Island. The most important thing is that this situation seems to have lasted for a few days. What do you want to say?" Li Tianlan asked faintly. His performance had been very rational and calm as ice, but the speed of his smoking kept increasing. One could vaguely see his inner eagerness. "What he wants to say is that your friend's strength isn't that terrible. How did they escape the encirclement for a few days? 2 superiors of the Thundershocking Realm and hundreds of elites. For the current East Island, this kind of power absolutely can't be wasted casually. But such a power chasing a few young people didn't get any results. Obviously, East Island doesn't want to kill them so soon." Horsewoman looked out of the window and said softly. At the beginning, when she got the news, she also hesitated whether to tell Li Tianlan the news or not. After all, this thing was full of weirdness, and no matter how she looked at it, it seemed like a trap. but in the end she decided to tell the truth. Because if this was a trap, the other side always had a way to let Li Tianlan know the news, so it was better to prepare early. I think the same as Horsewoman. Duke drove the car and said quickly, the reason why East Island didn't kill them is that they are waiting, and it's very likely that they are waiting for you. It's not too difficult for East Island to find the newly established East Emperor Palace, and the relationship between you and the boss is not a secret. If they just want to lure you there to threaten Samsara, then this action. Duke moved the corner of his mouth and sighed. You shouldn't go. If it's just to save your friend Horsewoman and I can go there. Just because it's a trap, I have to go there. Li Tianlan said faintly. The inside of the car suddenly fell into silence. After a full 5 minutes, Horsewoman sitting in the co-driver's seat sighed faintly and said, You don't trust us? This has nothing to do with trust. Li Tianlan twitched the corner of his mouth and said with a smile, You think too much. This had nothing to do with trust, it was just about standpoint. Qin Weibai could ask the super masters of Samsara to protect her with all their strength, not because of her amazing potential. To put it bluntly, it was all because he was Qin Weibai's man, that was all. She asked the super masters of Samsara to protect her man, but she would never ask the super masters of Samsara to protect her man's friend at all costs. The super masters of Samsara were not so cheap. So even if he knew that there might be a trap ahead, Li Tianlan had to go, because only when he was there could he be sure that Duke and Horsewoman would do their best at all costs. Horsewoman turned her head, took a deep look at Li Tianlan and said no more. Zhongjing, that's not a fun place. Fortunately, Tianhai Wuji is trapped in Zhongzhou state. Otherwise, Zhongjing is simply a black hole for other forces in the dark world. Even without Tianhai Wuji, we should have taken Flaming Fire with us just now so that we have more confidence. Duke suddenly said. Flaming Fire has other tasks. Li Tianlan shook his head and lit another cigarette. The second batch of elites of the Snowdance Corps is about to arrive in Changdao, and their concealment needs to be handled by Flaming Fire. Duke nodded and said thoughtfully, the second batch. It seems that Zhongzhou state has to speed up. But it's right. The current situation can't be delayed any longer. I just don't know who will lead the team this time. It's a neutral figure. Li Tianlan's heart skipped a beat and he said softly, Do you know the 4 spirits of Zhongzhou state? The 4 spirits generals? Which one will lead the team this time? Azure Dragon or White Tiger? Duke was stunned and then he suddenly whistled. Even the Terracotta Army has appeared. It seems that Zhongzhou state has invested a lot this time. The leader this time is Azure Dragon Gong Sun Chi, known as General of 9 Heavens, one of the 4 captains of the Terracotta Army. Li Tianlan answered Duke's question, but his eyes were looking at Horsewoman. You said that this time Wang Xingxiao and Gu Hanshan are fighting for a quarter of the leadership of the Terracotta Army? As far as I know, the 4 spirits should be neutral figures, right? Theoretically, yes. Horsewoman nodded. But there's something unexpected this time. Among the 4 spirits generals, one has a clear position. Li Tianlan looked at her quietly, waiting for her to continue. Today's 4 spirits generals of Zhongzhou state are Gong Sun Chi, General of 9 Heavens, codenamed Azure Dragon. General of 9 Serenities Shang, codenamed White Tiger. General of 9 Heavens Yi, codenamed Vermilion Bird. Horsewoman said slowly, Gong Sun Chi, Shang and Yi, these 3 generals are absolutely neutral figures. But the 4th one is not. The last one of the 4 spirits is Jiang Shan, General of 9 Regions, codenamed Black Tortoise. Jiang Shan. Li Tianlan suddenly raised his eyebrows. Which Jiang Shan? Naturally, it's Jiang Shan, the leader of Beijiang Province, the father of Jiang Shanyu. This time, it's also him who will step down from the position of the 4 spirits. Horsewoman said flatly, the last Black Tortoise died in the battle in Beijiang 5 years ago. In recent years, the situation in Beijiang has been sensitive, so this position was won by Jiang Shan. He was originally a transitional figure, but in the past 5 years he has done a good job, so no one has ever touched him. Jiang Shan himself is a member of the decision-making committee of Zhongzhou state, and now he is the general of 9 regions, holding a quarter of the Terracotta Army. His words are more confident than most members of the decision-making committee. If he hadn't violated the rules this time, he might not necessarily step down from this position. Violated the rules? It's just an excuse. When he took the position, some people were reluctant. Don't forget what time it was 5 years ago. Now everything is almost stable and it's time to counterattack. Who is willing to let Jiang Shan continue in this position? Duke suddenly interrupted in a playful tone. Li Tianlan was thoughtful. 5 years ago, it should be a critical period for the academics and the prince group to replace the old Duke meant that Jiang Shan could sit in the position of one of the four spirits because the academics made concessions? Was it also because of the academics that Jiang Shan was going to step down this time? But even if Jiang Shan stepped down, the current competitors were Gu Hanshan and Wang Xingxiao. Jiang Shangyu was also qualified to compete because of his relationship with Jiang Shan. Of these three candidates, the academics were willing to see each of them. There was no doubt that the power of other groups caused this result. If one didn't participate in this kind of fight between immortals, outsiders would never know. Li Tianlan didn't want to think too much about it. He just said casually, Gu Hanshan and Wang Xingxiao are not qualified to participate in the fight for Spirit Tortoise, are they? Their strength is not a problem. Horsewoman shook her head. The four spirits are now all superiors of the half-step invincible realm, but they haven't been transformed, so they need to be replaced. It's not a big problem to take this opportunity to replace them with a young man. As for the position, the four spirits are neutral, but how can anyone be absolutely neutral? Therefore, Zhongzhou State also gave the four spirits a restriction, that is, they could not express their views on anything in the country. Jiang Shan's current position is so sensitive because he holds several positions. Once he speaks, the issue of position does not have too many restrictions on him, which is the last thing the higher-ups want to see. This time, it is said that Jiang Shan privately used the terracotta army to do things, which violated the rules, so he was caught. Otherwise, Horsewoman didn't continue, but Li Tianlan understood what she meant. An absolutely neutral position seemed to be useless, but it was the best position to quickly accumulate prestige and connections. The four spirits only dealt with external affairs, not internal affairs. Therefore, they wouldn't get into too many domestic disputes and interests, and it was easy to be recognized by others with the accumulation of contributions. Whether Wang Xingxiao or Gu Hanshan sat in this position, 10 years later when they entered the invincible realm and accumulated enough prestige, what would the situation be like? How ambitious they are. Li Tianlan sneered and said, they have a long-term vision. Of course. Whether it is Wang Tianzong or Gu Xingyun, they are all ambitious. How can ambitious people limit their vision to what is in front of them? Duke smiled and said. Li Tianlan closed his eyes and kept silent. Vaguely, he seemed to have seen the plan of the Wang family of Beihai and Kunlun City. 20 years ago, the position of the war god of Zhongzhou State belonged to the Li family, and the Wang family of Beihai couldn't fight for it. His father suddenly died that year, and Gu Xingyun took advantage of the situation to ascend the position. In the face of the general trend, the Wang family of Beihai couldn't go against nature and could only acquiesce to this result. But what about today, 20 years later? The position of the war god was now in the hands of Kunlun City. How could the Wang family of Beihai not fight for it? Why not? But Kunlun City didn't want to give up either. Jiang Shan broke the rules and wanted to retire, and no one should object except the prince group. The position of Spirit Tortoise was replaced by new blood, in order to push Gu Hanshan or Wang Xingxiao up. In this respect, the Wang family of Beihai and Kunlun City must have secretly made efforts to make Jiang Shan abdicate. But now the academics couldn't find a candidate who could compete with Wang Xingxiao and Gu Hanshan. Li Tianlan might be one, but his combat strength was strong, but his realm was low. No matter how the terracotta army replaced new blood, it didn't need to replace an ice-condensing realm expert. In addition, the academics sensed the competition between Kunlun City and the Wang family of Beihai and didn't want to get involved, so they simply chose to swallow the loss or find a way out. That was the fact. The academics was the main force and let Jiang Shan retire. But before they had time to recommend one of their own, the big peach was taken away by the Wang family of Beihai and Kunlun City. One of the four spirits of Zhongzhou State. Controlling the strongest superforce in Zhongzhou State, and in a position where it was the easiest to accumulate reputation and credit. It was no exaggeration to say that the winner between Gu Hanshan and Wang Xingxiao in this competition might be directly related to the ownership of the next war god. The two were fighting for the position of the war god, which was the advancement and retreat of the two superforces in the future 10 years later. No wonder, no wonder. Li Tianlan's eyes flickered and he sneered. Wang Xingxiao. Gu Hanshan. Whoever could compete for the position of Spirit Tortoise would be closer to the position of the war god, and the other would be farther away from the position of the war god. But in the same way, Li Tianlan would be farther away from that position. It was in Li Tianlan's best interest that neither of them could get the position. He had to think of a way. He had to. Zhongzhou State's plan. The Battle of Changdao. What about after that? Since the trip to East Island had become a test for Gu Hanshan and Wang Xingxiao. Since they wanted to destroy their ideas. They had to figure out Zhongzhou State's plan. All disputes were nothing more than interests. Li Tianlan absolutely didn't believe that Zhongzhou State sent them here just to kill people. That was meaningless. So, I'm curious. Li Tianlan suddenly said, this is East Island. Since we entered East Island, what we've been doing seems to be killing people. Does it make sense? Why does Zhongzhou State think that when everything is over, we can violate the will of East Island within its territory and let the dark world of East Island belong to us? In the end, what on earth can we get? The territory belongs to East Island, the people belong to East Island, and the channels belong to East Island. He paused and said with a self-mocking smile, we can't retreat after killing people, right? I can't figure out how we can stand firm in East Island. That's because you haven't seen the real general trend of the dark world. Horsewoman smiled and said softly, it's a warrior's business to serve the country wholeheartedly and move forward. The thoughts of politicians, businessmen, and ordinary people are the most difficult to capture. Chapter 178. The heavy rain spread from Dongdu to Zhongjing. It rained heavily all over the city. Torrential rain fell from the sky, covering the streets and alleys of Zhongjing and the long forest outside the city. There was water everywhere. The gloomy sky became dark as far as the eye could see, as if it was the end of the world. There was nowhere to escape, no way to retreat. The dense forest had become muddy because of the continuous rain. There was a faint light outside the forest, but it was still as dark as night in the forest. The dense shadows of the trees seemed to swallow the light, the branches swayed with the wind and rain, and the leaves were colorful. In the dangerous situation, the trees in the dark environment seemed to be making threatening gestures, revealing a kind of gloomy and ferocious feeling. In the dark forest wind and rain, someone retreated. Slowly retreated. The sound of footsteps mixed with the whistling of the wind echoed in the area from all directions of the forest. A steady voice sounded from the walkie-talkie with a tone that made people despair. East Control. West Control. South Control. North Control. The encirclement is complete. Requesting to close the net. With every sentence, the body of the person who was retreating would instinctively stagnate. When the last request to close the net sounded, he finally stopped. He was at least 2 meters tall like a giant, with a calm face. His upper body clothes had been completely torn, and the suffocating muscles of his whole body were exposed to everyone. Blood flowed down his thick arms and chest and fell to the ground in the heavy rain. He stopped, clenched his fists, and stared calmly at the group of figures moving in unison in front of him. Gradually, a fierce light like a raging fire lit up from his pupils, fierce and wild. There was a desolate killing in the dark rain. A man in his 50s stood in front of the giant-like figure. He wore a white robe, a white hat, and a pair of white boots. He was spotless, and the raindrops falling from the sky were blown away by an invisible airflow when they were 2 or 3 meters away from him. The man in white stood in the air, and his wrinkled face, which seemed to be full of kindness, had a twisted smile on it. He looked like a ghost. The game is about to end. The man in white smiled and said, I have to say the game is very interesting, but I'm tired of it. You should go back with me. I can guarantee that you will be treated like VIPs. Of course, that is before you have any value. Who are you? The giant in front of the white-clothed man said in a low voice. His body stood ramrod straight in the rain, appearing particularly fierce and fierce. However, there was an unconcealable weakness and powerlessness in his voice. I'm Byakuya. The man in white said indifferently, Limitless Palace's right guest. You don't need to introduce yourself. I know you. You are Su Chu, the first disciple of the Jade Pool in the Central State. You're not bad. You haven't reached the Thundershocking realm, but you killed one of my trusted subordinates in the Thundershocking realm. You're all very good. Well, let me see. The one beside you, if I am not wrong, is from Mount Shu in Zhongzhou State? Great Void Sword Master? I also know this person. He's from the Border Praetorian Corps. I have never seen these two ladies before, but I do recognize the future princess. White Knight's tiny eyes glowed with a strange excitement. I have to say, you are the most valuable prey I've encountered recently. Smart and powerful. But it's a pity that you still haven't escaped from the hunter. There was silence. In the almost frozen atmosphere, Su Chu, who was standing in the front, took a step back calmly. Several figures that were blocked by his huge body or hidden in the darkness also took a step forward at the same time. The 6 people gathered together at once. They kept retreating. Although they knew there was no way back, it was not in their character to sit still and wait for death. A sneer flashed in Byakuya's eyes. He waved his hand slightly, and dozens of elites of the Limitless Palace behind him immediately followed him and moved forward. The frozen atmosphere became more and more oppressive, like a prelude to an imminent outbreak. Be careful. Don't hurt our princess. A voice suddenly sounded beside Byakuya. In the crowd, a man in a bright red robe stepped through the crowd and directly appeared beside Byakuya. The wide red robe completely covered his limbs and head. The red robe was as red as blood, and the wide hem was fluttering in the wind. He was also floating in the air, but standing beside Byakuya, he didn't look like a person at all, but more like a piece of clothes floating in the air. Of course. A disdainful look flashed in Byakuya's eyes and he said expressionlessly, I won't hurt your princess, but you can't hurt the others here. Tianyu, take the people you want away later, and the others must go back to the Limitless Palace with me. The red robe floating in the air moved slightly as if it was nodding. The footsteps from all directions were getting closer and closer with the wind, and an oppressive momentum spread in the forest. Suchu's face became more and more serious. He didn't know Byakuya, but he knew the red robe beside him. Tianyu, the high priest of the ISE Grand Shrine, was a real superior of the half-step invincible realm. In the past many days he had been the main force to hunt them down. The cause of the matter was completely inexplicable. They successfully killed their target during a hunting operation, and there was a young man in his 30s with the target. There was no mercy in this kind of war that concerned countries. Suchu was completely instinctive and intended to kill the young man to keep his mouth shut. However, the young man who seemed to have no martial arts suddenly became violent and instantly injured Suchu. At that moment, the fastest person to react was not Li Beidian and Ning Qianqing, but Dongqing Rushi, who had just joined them in the hunting operation. The two fought for a short time. Although Suchu was injured, it was not fatal, and the young man whose strength was in the thunder-shocking realm successfully escaped the scene. From the beginning to the end, the young man only said one sentence. What's more, it was perfect Chinese. I'll remember you. That was the beginning of their nightmare. In less than 2 hours, the Divine Path forces of East Island, the Underworld, and the Special Warfare elites swarmed into action, from Ninghu to Juban and then to Zhongjing. The pursuers also changed from the fire-flaming realm to the thunder-shocking realm, and even Tianyu, the high priest of the ISE Grand Shrine, was sent. Until now, they didn't even know the specific identity of the young man. But it didn't matter anymore. If Tianyu's target was only Dongqing Rushi, then Bai Ye's target was everyone. It smelled like a conspiracy, which also meant that they were directly involved in the general trend of the two countries from the very beginning, from the original personal grievances. It was meaningless to think about other things. Breaking out of the encirclement was the only choice. But breaking out of the encirclement? Where could they break out of the encirclement? Senior brother, let's take a risk and go east. A weak voice sounded as if it was dying. If it doesn't work, just leave me here. Every one of us can leave. Suchu's body shook. He turned around and looked at Ning Qianqing behind him. Ning Qianqing's face had begun to show the color of death. He held Yu Qingyan, who was in a coma, tightly in his arms and smiled reluctantly and weakly. I'm afraid I can't make it. As he spoke, he pushed Yu Qingyan, who was in his arms, towards Suchu, and his voice grew weaker. Take care of her. And Rushi, I can't. I'm sorry, General. What the hell are you talking about? We're leaving together. Drunbility Ching UF** King, hold on unless I die, otherwise. Li Beidian grabbed Ning Qianqing's collar, but he paused in the middle of his words. Ning Qianqing seemed to smile reluctantly and fainted again. Carry Qingyan. Li Beidian gritted his teeth and carried Ning Qianqing on his back. He told Yi Huayu and said in a low voice, Go east, break out of the encirclement. You guys go. A clear voice suddenly sounded. Eldest senior brother, you take them to break out of the encirclement. I'll block them. You? Everyone turned around at the same time. A very young girl stood beside Yi Huayu. The girl looked to be in her 20s at most. She looked a little immature, but she was incomparably beautiful. She was slender and tall, more than 7 meters tall. Her black tights were somewhat torn, revealing a lot of white and tender skin. At this time she was supporting Yu Qingyan with Yi Huayu. Seeing everyone's eyes turn to her, she nodded and said seriously, I'll block them. The blood on her face could not hide her beauty. Her long black hair was not soaked by the rain but wantonly danced in the wind. Her eyes were calm and clear, but at this moment, there was an unshakable firmness in them. I can do it. This was an extremely beautiful girl with a focused and pure temperament. She stood in the night rain like a clear mountain spring, cold but with a temperament that could nourish everything. Elegant and noble, untainted by dust. Dongqing Rushi. Li Beidian slightly raised his eyebrows. Although he did not intend to retreat, he did not say anything. From the bottom of his heart, he was still a little dissatisfied with Dongqing Rushi. It was not because of anything else but because of her concealment. Yes, concealment. At least Li Beidian thought so. From Ninghu to Jubin and then to Zhongjing for nearly half a month, they almost escaped the pursuit all the time. But Dongqing Rushi rarely made a move from the beginning to the end. Among the 6 people, everyone had a role. But when he thought about it carefully, Dongqing Rushi seemed to have never played any role. 3 days ago, Su Chu personally killed Leng Shui, an expert of the thunder-shocking realm from Wuji Palace. 5 days ago, Li Beidian and Yi Huayu joined hands to launch a sneak attack and seriously injured an expert of the thunder-shocking realm. 2 experts of the fire-flaming realm died under the sword of Mount Shu. Li Beidian and Yi Huayu were also seriously injured. 7 days ago, Su Chu personally led them out of Ninghu and into the territory of Jubin. 10 days ago, Yu Qingyan was the weakest in the team, but she contributed the most. Seriously injured Tianyu, an expert of the half-step invincible realm. No one could tell what was going on. 10 days ago, Tianyu appeared for the first time. He had a domineering momentum. Su Chu was at the forefront and the 6 people besieged him, but they were still no match for him. In the melee, Yu Qingyan, who had been wandering on the periphery, gave Tianyu a light blow when no one noticed. Then the high priest of the ISE Grand Shrine exploded. It was not his body that exploded, but his blood. Countless drops of blood turned into blood mist, spraying from every part of his body with high temperature. Almost in the blink of an eye, Tianyu's strength dropped by at least a small realm. Tianyu, who was shocked and angry, had no intention to stay. He subconsciously counterattacked and turned to leave. But the counterattack that was supposed to kill Yu Qingyan was completely blocked by Ning Qianqing. After the battle, Yu Qingyan fell into a coma. Ning Qianqing was also seriously injured and dying. However, this battle also successfully made the pursuers have scruples. It was said that Tianyu was poisoned, but so far no one could tell what the poison was. With doubts in their hearts, the pursuers naturally wouldn't go all out to chase after them. Anyway, they had escaped for so long and finally reached Zhongjing. In Zhongjing, ISE Grand Shrine and Wuji Palace cooperated fully. Although the pursuit was intense, it seemed that the pursuers had given up the idea of taking their lives. For a few days they stubbornly held on, but now all their supplies had been completely exhausted, and their physical strength and willpower had been exhausted. Retreat? There was really no way out. And in the whole process, what did Dongqing Rushi do? She also attacked, but from beginning to end she didn't seem to draw her sword. A young expert who ranked above him in Zhongzhou State. A young expert who had reached the peak of the fire-flaming realm at the age of 19. Her role was even less than that of Yi Huayu. Li Beidian was not afraid of death, nor was he afraid of dying for his friends. But what Dongqing Rushi did really made him feel a little uncomfortable. No. Su Chu shook his head without hesitation. I'll stop them. You go. You can't stop them. Dongqing Rushi looked at Su Chu and said bluntly. Su Chu opened his mouth and his face changed slightly. You want to? It's really touching, but I'm sorry to tell you that none of you can leave. A gentle and elegant voice suddenly sounded. You now have 2 choices. First, come back to Dongdu with me as a guest. Second, go to Wuji Palace as a guest. A streak of blue lightning suddenly flashed in the rain. The lightning dispelled the darkness. In the extreme brilliance, the figure of a young man directly walked out of the lightning. Dongqing Rushi quietly looked at the lightning in front of her, blinked her clear eyes and didn't speak. Tianyu, the high priest of ISE Grand Shrine, and Bai Yi, the right advisor of Wuji Palace, bowed slightly at the same time. Greetings, Your Highness. Your Highness. This was the honorific title for invincible realm experts in the Dark World, but it was not absolute. For example, Wang Yuetong, the little princess of the Wang family of Beihai, was often called Her Highness, the Palace Master. However, such a term could not be used casually. Those who were worthy of such a title either had absolute strength or had a status worthy of such a title. His Highness in Japan? Thinking of the princess that Tianyu mentioned just now, Su Chu and Li Beidian looked at each other slightly. Was this young man they met in the hunting operation a prince of the royal family of East Island? The young man nodded casually. He was wearing a very ordinary sportswear with short hair and an ordinary appearance. He was short like the men of East Island, and he didn't have any extra ornaments on him. But every move he made showed a kind of indescribable nobility. That was the temperament that was cultivated when he was in a respected position all year round, unattainable. "What? Haven't you started yet?" the young man asked casually. His tone was soft, but in the ears of Su Chu and Li Beidian, his tone became extremely rigid when translated by the translator. "We're getting ready." Tianyu straightened up and said respectfully. The young man nodded casually and pointed at Dongqing Rushi. His eyes were a little hot. "This woman, don't hurt her. From tonight on she belongs to me. I won't marry you." Dongqing Rushi looked at the young man who suddenly showed up quietly. There was no hostility in her eyes, only a pure concentration and seriousness that people couldn't see through. "What?" The young man was stunned, as if he had encountered something interesting. He said with a playful smile, "Maybe I should introduce myself. I'm Prince Renwu of the royal family of East Island. I can forgive your sins in East Island, and I'll even consider letting you be my princess. It's your honor. After all, I have to bear a lot of pressure to marry Ashina Sao as my princess. But you're very attractive to me. I won't marry you." Her tone was crisp. Dongqing Rushi repeated it again. She looked at Prince Renwu and said seriously, "I have a fiancé." Prince Renwu raised his eyebrows slightly. "Who is it?" His tone was short, but he couldn't help but reveal a trace of gloominess. But then he thought of her identity, took a deep breath, and calmed himself down again. The daughter of the commander of the Border Praetorian Corps of Zhongzhou State. Getting such a woman was even related to the overall situation of East Island. Even if she wasn't a virgin, Prince Renwu was willing to accept her. "I haven't seen him yet." Dongqing Rushi shook her head, and her clear eyes seemed to be a little wronged. "I don't know if I can see him in the future." She raised her head, looked at the rainy sky through the dense branches and leaves of the trees and sighed softly. "You guys go." She stepped forward and said. "Junior sister?" Su Chu opened his mouth and his tone was dry. "We have no choice," Dongqing Rushi said softly. Her black hair danced wildly in the wind. She stepped on the breeze and stepped on the night rain. She reached out her hand. For many days, for many years, the long sword that she had been carrying on her back this whole time was gently removed by her slender hand. "The name of the sword is Silence," she said softly, and her soft and almost ethereal tones spread in the forest. In an instant, the dense sword intent roared and surged, covering the forest. This was the sword of Jade Pool. The sword of Jade Pool was also Dongqing Rushi. In the mountain wind and the night rain, a trace of extremely bright fierceness suddenly flashed in Dongqing Rushi's eyes. Silence was about to be unsheathed. "I'm in a desperate situation and so is the enemy." Chapter 179. Prince Renwu took a step back subconsciously, looking serious. The famous sword Silence? He looked at Dongqing Rushi, who was walking forward step by step, and asked seriously. There were 12 murderous weapons in the Dark World, but there was no ranking list of famous swords. Although there was no ranking list, Silence was definitely one of the famous swords in the Dark World. In the past 500 years, there had been 6 superiors of the Invincible Realm in Jade Pool, and all of them were known as the most powerful grandmasters of swordsmanship in the Dark World. Among the 6 superiors of the Invincible Realm, 3 of them used the famous sword Silence as their personal sword. The most recent superior of the Invincible Realm in Jade Pool died 20 years ago. After he died, Silence was really quiet. The Dark World was forgetful, but it also respected the strong. 20 years, an era, people might forget the name of the superior of the Invincible Realm, but Jade Pool still stood in Zhongzhou State, and the reputation of Silence would not disappear. This was one of the 3 famous swords in Jade Pool, and now it appeared in Dongqing Rushi's hands. How could people not feel strange? This was not something that could be explained by underestimating Dongqing Rushi's status in Jade Pool. Such a famous sword, which was related to the rise and fall of Jade Pool, was in the hands of a young disciple. It was surprising, but it also made people feel a trace of strange danger. Dongqing Rushi was still moving forward. The terrifying sword intent kept spreading in all directions with her as the center. The sound of wind and rain in the forest gradually faded away, and only the sound of the sword intent breaking through the air was whistling up and down, echoing in the whole darkness. She reached out to hold the sword. At this moment, Dongqing Rushi looked even more pure and flawless. She seemed to be exuding a feeling that she was one with heaven and earth, elegant and sacred, with a trace of unattainable majesty. What? But it suppressed everything. Is she really at the peak of the fire-flaming realm? Li Beidian, who was carrying Ning Chenqing on his back, carefully looked at Dongqing Rushi's back, and suddenly looked back at Su Chu, asking with a serious face. In his sight, Dongqing Rushi seemed to be completely wrapped by the sword intent. Her flying long hair, her tall and slender body, and her graceful figure seemed to have disappeared in the sword intent. Or in other words, she was completely integrated with silence. It was impossible to describe the feeling in his heart. Dongqing Rushi still seemed to be Dongqing Rushi. There was no soaring momentum, no sharp edge, but Li Beidian could clearly feel that she was different now. It was hard to tell exactly what was different. It was not a particularly dangerous feeling, but it was extremely heavy, pressing down on the depths of one's heart, as if there was some kind of unbearable magic. She is, Su Chu said in a low voice. The first senior brother of the Jade Pool, who could face anything calmly and resolutely at any time, now looked a little gloomy, helpless, sad, and determined. But that sword is not. What? Li Beidian was stunned. In your eyes, who is Rushi? Su Chu looked at Li Beidian and suddenly asked. Genius. Li Beidian simply gave a very accurate evaluation. A 19-year-old expert at the peak of the fire-flaming realm was definitely a genius. He paused for a second as he thought of Yao Qi and added, a genius in sword principle. Su Chu looked at him deeply and suddenly said in a low voice, you're right. But do you know that when Rushi entered Jade Pool at the age of 6, she was in charge of the famous sword Silence at the age of 8? She wielded the famous sword Silence at the age of 8. She's 19 this year. She hasn't drawn her sword even once in 11 years? Su Chu took a deep breath and said heavily, not even once. Li Beidian was stunned. Dongqing Rushi, the well-known genius in sword principle of Jade Pool in Zhongzhou State, had never used a sword since she started martial arts? This news was really shocking. Even though he was in a desperate situation, Li Beidian still couldn't come to his senses. Accumulating strength to nurture a sword? Li Beidian asked. This method was magical but not unbelievable. Martial arts was a mysterious world with countless secrets. In the past countless years, a large number of geniuses had created countless methods to break through to the invincible realm. Li Beidian had never heard of this method, but it didn't mean it didn't exist. It's communication and integration. After correcting Li Beidian, Su Chu didn't continue. There were even some things that even he didn't understand. People had sword intent. Swords had sword energy. And Jade Pool had swords. For many years, Dongqing Rushi had been quietly cultivating in the Jade Pool. She didn't act like she didn't want anyone to get close to her, but she rarely communicated with others. Su Chu was the eldest senior brother. He knew that this junior sister was communicating and merging. But even he didn't know whether she was communicating and integrating sword or sword energy. But there was one thing he didn't tell Li Beidian. For nearly 200 years, there were 4 people in charge of silence, and 3 of them were experts in the invincible realm. And Dongqing Rushi. The 4 people all practiced the same sword principle. It was the sword and unique skill that ran through time. They were of the same origin. Can she stop Tianyu and Bai Yi? Li Beidian took a deep breath and finally focused on the situation in front of him. He asked in a low voice. Yes. Su Chu said simply, because she has silence. In the hands of others, even in Jade Pool, silence was just a sharp famous sword. But in Dongqing Rushi's hands, it was the sword intent that ran through time and years. Dongqing Rushi was at the peak of the fire-flaming realm. But silence was not. But she will die. The best result is that her foundation will be completely destroyed and she will be alive at most. Su Chu continued. Li Beidian fell silent. From Su Chu's tone, he could totally hear how slim the hope of the so-called best result was. He smiled. It's not my character to abandon my teammates and run away. Even if you will die. Even if you will die. He put Ning Chenqing on the ground and handed him to Yi Huayu. His eyes were full of calmness when he looked at Su Chu. Su Chu's determined and calm face seemed to soften a little in the darkness. He nodded, turned around and strode toward Dongqing Rushi. He said softly, yes, even if I will die. Dongqing Rushi was still moving forward. The awe-inspiring sword intent had completely twisted the air around her. In the darkness, her figure was faintly discernible, but the holy and flawless temperament became more and more distant. It seemed to be out of instinct. Prince Renwu stepped back again. Bai Yi was stepping back. Tianyu was also stepping back. He was stepping back unconsciously. The sword intent that covered the whole forest didn't seem dangerous or murderous, but it seemed to have an irresistible momentum. You can't escape. In the blurry sword intent, Dongqing Rushi's clear voice rang out. Her figure was almost completely gone, but everyone could imagine how she looked like when she was talking seriously. Escape. Prince Renwu suddenly came to his senses. Until now he didn't realize that he was stepping back. Not only him but all of them were stepping back. They didn't know how long it had been, but as this woman moved forward, they had stepped back at least 50 meters. The prince's gentle expression suddenly became cold, and a ferocious and violent emotion flashed in his eyes. Then he calmed down again. Maybe it's me who is most suitable to say that. There are many of you, Dongqing Rushi said softly. Dongqing Rushi said softly. The sword intent in the forest seemed to be getting sharper, but her tone was still clear and a little sad. But it's useless. Prince Renwu sneered even more. 3 superiors of the thunder-shocking realm, one of whom was a half-step to invincible realm, and hundreds of elites were forced to step back dozens of meters by a girl who was less than 20 years old. This was simply a great humiliation. The prince didn't want to say anything more. He had to do something to prove himself. He took a deep breath, took a step forward, waved his hand suddenly and shouted, "Catch them." The elites of East Island, who were ready to close the net, had already rushed out before Prince Qin's voice faded away. At least 100 elites rushed out from different positions, and ice walls rose up one after another in the night rain. The killing intent was getting closer. The enemies were getting closer. "Why don't you retreat?" Dongqing Rushi's figure seemed to be blurred, but her pure voice rang in Su Chu and Li Baitian's ears. "Why should I leave?" Li Baitian held the great void sword in his hand, and as the long sword shook, his laughter became unprecedentedly arrogant and heroic. "Kill the enemies." Amidst his maniacal laughter, his figure suddenly became illusory. The great void sword pointed straight at the night sky. A tiny and weak flame lit up at the tip of the sword. All of a sudden the flame started to shake violently. Then it spread rapidly. The flame was still a flame, but layers and layers of hot air waves suddenly appeared in the air. They were invisible and intangible, but they instantly evaporated the ice around them. The hot and illusory sword intent spread out wildly in the night rain. It seemed illusory and real, and it was everywhere. A vast and heavy sword intent suddenly fell to the ground from the sky. Endless firelight suddenly burned in every corner visible to the naked eye. Su Chu was expressionless, but he flew up like a fierce tiger, rushing straight to the crowd without any detour. The sword intent mixed with the firelight was extremely condensed in the air, one after another. It was like a storm, like a wild thunder. The sword intent broke the ice walls on the ground, and smashed the East Island elites hiding behind the ice walls into the ground. That was an almost endless power, grand and heavy. The unique technique of Jade Pool. The roaring sword of wind and thunder. Kill the enemies. They were in a hopeless situation. If they didn't want to leave, what else could they do but kill the enemies? The result? They didn't want to do what they didn't want to do, which meant they were ready to face the worst result. Everything was meaningless. They could only kill the enemies. They could only kill the enemies. The fire rose under the curtain of rain. The sword wills of Jade Pool and Mount Shu blended and spread. The moisture in the muddy forest was evaporated instantly. The cracked ice, the flying blood, and the fallen trees were almost completely destroyed at the same time. Within a radius of dozens of meters, there was nothing but scorched earth. Dongqing Rushi stopped. She didn't look at Prince Renwu or the battle beside her. She just lowered her head and looked at the sword in her hand quietly. The body of silence was simple and slender. The only thing different about it was that the shape of the hilt was different from the usual longsword. The hilt of silence was flatter and slender, looking very elegant and smooth. This was the sword that the 3 invincible realm experts of Jade Pool used to carry. This was the famous sword that represented the strongest kendo of Jade Pool. Dongqing Rushi's eyes were focused. In her sight, the firelight that kept lighting up was fluctuating and twisting in the forest. In the brightening light, the body of silence seemed to shake a little. Crack! A tiny crack appeared on the sheath of silence. Dongqing Rushi's beautiful and holy face suddenly turned pale. Boom! The sword intent that covered the whole forest suddenly made an exploding sound. With silence as the center, the surging sword intent burst out like a mountain flood. In the loud bang, Dongqing Rushi suddenly screamed. Her clear voice twisted and spread with the sword intent. Without a sound, all the trees within a radius of 100 meters were blown apart. The invisible sword intent swept through all the ice walls nearby. The ice walls collapsed and the ice pieces flew. The whole forest looked like it was the end of the world. All the elites of East Island disappeared. Only the exploding flesh and blood were floating in the air. Let's go together. Kill her. Prince Renwu's face changed dramatically. In the nightmarish scene in front of him, he could only feel death and despair. The position of the princess. The border Praetorian Corps of Zhongzhou State. The future situation of East Island. Everything disappeared in his mind. Only by killing Dongqing Rushi could they live. Or in other words, only by destroying the sword could they live. At this moment, Dongqing Rushi's figure seemed to have disappeared completely. The sword energy between heaven and earth crazily gathered toward the body of Silence. The sheath of Silence was full of cracks. The ancient long sword was spinning crazily in Dongqing Rushi's hand, emitting a crazy light. This sword seemed to come alive all of a sudden. Tianyu and Bai Ye's faces also changed dramatically. Without any hesitation, the three of them rushed to Dongqing Rushi wrapped in the dazzling lightning. Dongqing Rushi's eyes were almost peaceful and quiet. Her face was like jade, and her sword intent was like a rainbow. She knew the consequences of this sword strike, and naturally she also knew the power of this sword strike. For countless years, the people who held Silence had to practice the same unique technique. The unique technique of the same origin, the same sword, and the sword intent that ran through it. They merged with each other. To some extent, Dongqing Rushi was walking on the path that the three seniors of the Invincible Realm had walked on, the smoothest path without any detours. That was why her realm could improve so fast, because there was no bottleneck at all. Silence, the sword intent that belonged to the three seniors in the sword, was her martial arts, the martial arts that could directly enter the Invincible Realm. This was her secret. Over the years, her realm of martial arts had been increasing with the constant understanding of the sword intent of Silence. If nothing went wrong when she completely understood the sword intent of Silence and the unique technique of Jade Pool, she might be 30 or 35 years old. When she drew the sword, she would instantly rush into the Invincible Realm. But now it was not enough. Far from enough. It was enough for her to draw the sword by force with the strength of the peak of the fire-flaming realm. Silence was her martial arts road to the Invincible Realm, but in a desperate situation, it was also her strongest trump card. Killing enemies, killing relatives, and killing herself. She ignored the enemy in herself. She completely integrated her mind into the sword, and completely detonated the sword intent that belonged to the three seniors of the Invincible Realm. Not for climbing martial arts but for killing enemies on the spot. This was the most tragic way. It was equivalent to using Silence as a bridge to forcibly borrow the strength of the three seniors of the Invincible Realm. To some extent, this move was similar to Samsara in the 24 moves of Sword of the Li family, but it was more radical. A sword was drawn. The sword was destroyed and the person died. But in exchange it was a real attack of the Invincible Realm. No one could resist this sword, not Tianyu, not Bai Yi, not Su Chu, not Li Beidian, not Dongqing Rushi herself. I am in a desperate situation and so is the enemy. The cracks kept spreading in the surging sword intent. Dongqing Rushi, whose face was pale and bloodless, held the hilt tightly and drew the sword. Stop. A furious roar suddenly sounded from the distant sky, and it was spoken in Chinese. Did the reinforcements of Zhongzhou State arrive? But it was too late, it was too late. The sheath began to fall off. Dongqing Rushi's body was already out of control. She put more force into her palm. The blade suddenly came out of the sheath. The air suddenly became extremely quiet. The fire, lightning, and broken ice all disappeared in an instant. Only a misty cyan light that had been sealed for countless years flew out of the blade. That was the extremely powerful sword intent, and it was the purest cyan sword light. The sword light flew everywhere, dispelling the darkness in an instant, as if the whole world was blooming crazily. The unique technique of Jade Pool. The invincible sword of all paths. This was also one of the sword momentum that Dongqing Rushi majored in. The invincible sword of all paths, the invincible sword of all paths. Dongqing Rushi tightly pursed her lips. In the illusory scene before her death, a figure seemed to appear in front of her. In a trance, Dongqing Rushi saw a pair of eyes. The eyes were very complicated, very soft, and somewhat familiar. Crack. The unsheathed Silence was forced back into the sheath. The sword intent that belonged to the Invincible Realm seemed to be unwilling to give up and burst out crazily. But the hand that was pressing the hilt could not be resisted. Bit by bit, the unsheathed blade was forced back. Dongqing Rushi's body was completely out of control. She felt that someone held her palm, and then her whole body flew into the air uncontrollably. The unparalleled sword intent completely dissipated, and it turned into another sword. In the clear sound of the sword, Dongqing Rushi held silence tightly, but it seemed that someone directly took the long sword out of the sheath for her. The misty cyan light disappeared completely. Dongqing Rushi flew into the sky. In the vast night, the rain was still falling and the bright moon was rising. That was a scene that was enough to be remembered for a lifetime. It was unforgettable. In the rain, the snow-white sword light flew up, clear and holy like the bright moon. Dongqing Rushi's long hair danced, and her delicate body stretched in the air. She stabbed down from the extreme point of the moon-like sword light. The person and the sword and the person, merged into one in the light. She was extremely beautiful. At this moment, Dongqing Rushi seemed to be able to topple the whole world. Chapter 180. It seemed to be rising and falling at the same time. The sword light was like a bright moon, rising in the curtain of rain. The whistling sword light intertwined in the air, stirring up the wind and clouds and stirring up the night rain. Under the clear sword light, the vast sword intent poured out unscrupulously. The unique technique of Jade Pool. The flying fairy from outer space. Under the sword light, the silent sword was still dazzling, but Dongqing Rushi became the only one in the world. She held the sword and flew into the air. That was an indescribable elegance and beauty. Like the morning dew, like the wind and mist, like a dream out of this world. This was an unreal sword move, not to mention the sword move, but only the elegance. It was unparalleled in the world. The world was like a misty painting covered with dust. An immortal came into the world and he and the sword became one, breaking through the painting. The sword couldn't be polluted, and the sword intent couldn't be blasphemed. Dongqing Rushi's figure fell from the sky. The sword light and the person and the sword energy merged together in an instant. Like a rainbow crossing the sky. The bright moon in the sky spread and condensed. From the top to the bottom, there was only one beam of light left between heaven and earth. That was the sword intent that completely surpassed the fire-flaming realm, and only the sword intent. The person and the sword fell to the ground suddenly. The messy light and shadow spread all over the sky, and a large number of East Island elites nearby were blown away by the impact of the sword intent. The whole scene became twisted and blurred. The aftermath of the sword light gradually calmed down. 3 figures rushed into the forest at an extremely fast speed. In their sight, a large number of East Island elites had fallen down, and the formation was a mess. Su Chu, Li Baidian, Yu Qingyan, Yi Huayu, and Ning Chenxing were all there, but now they all fell on the ground and passed out. Dongqing Rushi stood there with the sword in her hand, but her delicate body was shaking slightly, facing Prince Renwu in front of her. Prince Renwu's clothes were almost completely torn, and a lot of blood came out of his body, making him look like a bloody man. He stared at Dongqing Rushi in front of him, and besides anger, there was only fear and abnormal brutality in his eyes. The extremely gorgeous sword light disappeared around them. Dongqing Rushi's beautiful big eyes dimmed down completely. She tried to blink and stared at Prince Renwu fearlessly. I won't. I have. Her voice was very soft, getting softer and softer. Finally, before she could finish her sentence, her body fell backwards. A pair of strong arms caught her from behind. The movement of the owner of the arm was a little stiff, and he did not take the opportunity to hug her. Dongqing Rushi was in a daze. She tried her best to widen her dim but still exquisite eyes. In his line of sight was the face of a young man. It was a very ordinary face, but his eyes were extremely deep and gentle. This was a face that she had never seen in person, but she had seen countless pictures of. It was a name that he had heard countless times since he was young. His grandfather said it, his grandmother said it, his father said it, and he was still saying it now. It was a name that had almost been implanted in his soul and blood. His own? Li Tianlan? Dongqing Rushi blinked, looked at the young man in front of her, and asked softly. Li Tianlan nodded. He looked a little embarrassed, but he just held Dongqing Rushi and didn't let her fall. He couldn't let go of her, but he couldn't not let go of her either. Sorry we're late, he said dryly. Dongqing Rushi shook her head, stared deeply at Li Tianlan and looked into his eyes. He was of average height and he seemed to be relatively thin. There was nothing special about his face, and his hairstyle was relatively ordinary. His eyes seemed to be the most attractive part, but if one didn't look carefully, it was hard to find anything special about him. Sure enough, he was a little ordinary. Dongqing Rushi thought quietly and suddenly said, "Am I ugly now?" As he said this, he subconsciously touched his dirty little face. No. Li Tianlan froze for a moment and told the truth. Dirty and ugly were 2 completely different concepts. After fleeing and fighting for many days, It would be strange if Dongqing Rushi could be clean. But now Dongqing Rushi, who looked like a little tabby cat, was not ugly at all. Although she was covered with dust, the beauty under the dust was more obvious. I must be ugly. You won't even hug me. Dongqing Rushi muttered softly, reached out two small hands, and was about to climb on Li Tianlan with a serious face. I'm very tired and I want to take a rest. Hug me. Li Tianlan's mind was in a mess. Looking at Dongqing Rushi's serious and clear eyes, he subconsciously put a little force in his arms and carried Dongqing Rushi horizontally. This scene seemed to be a little wrong. Li Tianlan didn't know what kind of scene was normal, but the scene in front of him didn't conform to any of his guesses at all. It seemed strange. He lowered his head. Dongqing Rushi squinted comfortably in his arms. She looked around, intentionally or unintentionally. The scene was clearly divided. It seemed that there were only enemies and their own people. A doubt flashed in Dongqing Rushi's eyes. Then she pointed at Prince Renwu not far away and said seriously, "This is Prince Renwu of the royal family. He wants to marry me, but I told him that I have a fiancée. You have to be careful." Li Tianlan raised his eyelids. In his sight, Prince Renwu's blood had solidified, and his wounds had stopped bleeding. His body also seemed to be covered with a thin layer of blood-colored ice. The heat inside the thin ice rose up, and with a muffled sound, the thin ice covering her body exploded instantly. Prince Renwu walked out of the flying ice pieces with a pale face. There were still some blood stains on his torn clothes, but the blood stains had already dried up and he looked refreshed. Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes. The two looked at each other. A strong killing intent and mockery flashed in the prince's eyes, and there seemed to be some vague excitement. But when he saw Dongqing Rushi in his arms, all the emotions in his eyes suddenly turned into killing intent. Li Tianlan twitched the corner of his mouth. He moved and appeared next to Duke. "How are you?" he asked in a short tone. He asked about the injuries of Ning Qianqing and the others. Although he sensed that they were just in a normal coma, it was obviously more effective to check them in person than to sense them. "There's nothing wrong." Duke's tone was a little doubtful and puzzled. "They just passed out, he hesitated and pointed at Ning Qianqing. "There's something wrong with him. His injury seems to be serious, but his vital signs are stable. I don't know how to say it. His injury is real, but now it looks like he's just a little injured." Li Tianlan breathed a sigh of relief and said softly, "It's good that he's fine." Duke still looked doubtful. He looked at Dongqing Rushi and suddenly said, "Miss Dongqing, was it you who used that sword move just now?" Dongqing Rushi nodded in Li Tianlan's arms. "But that's the sword intent of the invincible realm." Duke looked serious. Li Tianlan's heart moved a little and he looked down at Dongqing Rushi. "It's the sword intent of silence." Dongqing Rushi said softly. "Silence sword." Duke looked a little enlightened but at the same time confused. His eyes subconsciously fell on the ancient sword in Dongqing Rushi's hand. The scabbard of the ancient sword was already full of cracks. It looked like it would break at any moment and reveal the sword. However, the scabbard that was full of cracks did not break. It was as if it had been glued together. Duke was a little confused, but he also knew it was not the right time to ask. He shook his head and stopped talking. "I'm sleepy," Dongqing Rushi said softly and closed her eyes in Li Tianlan's arms. Before she fainted, that pair of eyes seemed to appear in her mind again. That pair of soft, complicated, deep, and vicissitudes of life eyes. That arm suppressed the unparalleled sword intent that she was about to break out. The invincible strike was destroyed, and the unparalleled sword intent was transformed into Jade Pool's unique skill, Heavenly Fairy. At that moment she wasn't the one using the sword. Instead, that arm was controlling her body and transferring the sword intent of Silent Sword. To put it simply, that sword move was not her own strength at all. Her consciousness became more and more hazy. Who was he? Where was he? With doubts, Dongqing Rushi struggled and finally fainted in Li Tianlan's arms. "Horsewoman!" Li Tianlan suddenly shouted. Horsewoman, who was taking care of the unconscious wounded, turned around and looked at Li Tianlan. "Take care of them." Li Tianlan handed Dongqing Rushi to Horsewoman and said in a calm tone. In front of them, Prince Renwu's gentle and playful voice rang out, sounding quite playful. Renwu pays his respects to the two super masters of samsara. He spoke fluent Chinese, looked at Li Tianlan who was walking over slowly and said with a smile, "Oh, and Mr. Li Tianlan, I've heard a lot about you. The East Island royals have been more and more shameless in recent years." Duke shrugged slightly, looked at Prince Renwu and said disdainfully, You want to use Dongqing Rushi to influence Dongqing Wudi? And then control the border Praetorian Corps? Old tricks, when have you ever succeeded? That's because they don't know what's good for them. Prince Renwu said blandly, it's their honor to be a relative of the royal family. A Shina woman, he pointed at Dongqing Rushi and said, I admit she's beautiful. I gave her the honor to be a princess, and her family should also serve the royal family. Is there anything wrong with that? Idiot. Duke curled his lips and said, do you deserve to be called the royal family? You're always playing crooked tricks and you don't have any boldness at all. What a fucking royal family. Renwu narrowed his eyes, and a flash of anger flashed in his eyes. He suddenly took a few steps back and said with a smile, then how about I do something bolder for once? Like inviting the two super masters of Samsara and Mr. Li Tianlan to the royal family as guests? In the dark forest again, Prince Renwu smiled confidently and evilly. He looked at Li Tianlan and said in a low voice, Dongqing Rushi is your fiancé? In the East Island Imperial Palace I'll personally make your fiancé my princess, and I'll let you watch the whole process with your own eyes, the whole process. Isn't it exciting? Ah. The corner of Li Tianlan's mouth twitched, and his eyes suddenly became extremely cold. Just by you. Duke sneered, and his eyes swept over and fell directly on the high priest of a grand shrine. Tianyue, do you think you can stop me? He turned his eyes to Bai Yi and said, do you think you can stop horsewoman? Maybe I can't. Half of Tianyue's red priest robe was torn, but his tone was calm. But do you really think we're the only ones? Duke, long time no see. In the lingering sound of Tianyue's words, a deep voice suddenly sounded. A figure wearing an ordinary East Island elite combat uniform walked out of the dark. He walked slowly and took off the combat helmet on his head. Under the helmet was a standard European white face, with slightly bloated cheeks and dazzling blonde hair. A golden cross hung on his neck, shining brightly in the darkness. Holy light. Duke slightly raised his eyebrows and subconsciously narrowed his eyes. The deputy commander of Knights Templars in Northern Europe, codenamed Holy Light, a superior a half-step to Invincible Realm. Duke looked a little surprised, but he didn't panic. You chose to cooperate with East Island at this time? The union of Samsara and heresy is the mortal enemy of Knights Templars. Holy Light said in a calm tone, you shouldn't stand with Dark Knights. The Duke sneered. In Zhongzhou State, Dark Knights showed their sincerity. In order to conspire with Zhongzhou State and Samsara against East Island, on the day of the final battle, Dark Knights even sent out the murderous weapon Dark Saint Spear, and became one of the main forces that trapped the commander of Knights Templars in Zhongzhou State. Did Holy Light come to East Island to cooperate with the royal family to take revenge on Samsara? Didn't I tell you before? I especially hate your smiling face. Every time I see you smile I want to kill you. A cold female voice cut through the darkness. Under the night sky, a woman with a graceful figure walked over. She was also wearing an ordinary combat uniform, but the slightly close-fitting combat uniform perfectly outlined her figure. She was graceful and alluring. Under the Duke's solemn gaze, the woman took off her helmet, revealing a delicate but extremely mature face. The Duke was expressionless. The woman threw the helmet at the Duke's feet and sneered, "What's wrong with looking at the helmet? I plan to use it to store your ashes and then throw it into the public toilet. That's how you Samsara bastards should end up." "Not a bad idea." The Duke said indifferently, "Why didn't I think of it when I killed your brother? If I throw Nimble Snake's ashes into the public toilet, it's a genius idea. Your brother won't have a chance to try it, but I will throw your ashes into the public toilet. Rattlesnake, you will like this ending." The woman was Rattlesnake. Before the destruction of Night Spirit, she was one of the top generals of Night Spirit, and her status was similar to the Duke in Samsara. Rattlesnake's ranking in Night Spirit was even higher than her biological brother Nimble Snake, and her combat capability was no less than that of the Duke. However, on the night when Samsara destroyed Night Spirit, Rattlesnake was seriously injured by Saint Duke, who was in charge of hunting down Rattlesnake, encountered the siblings. In order to cover Rattlesnake's escape, Nimble Snake died in his hands. The royal family of East Island IC Grand Shrine, Wuxia Palace, Knights Templars and the remnants of Night Spirit. Tonight was really lively. Was it really a trap? Such a big battle, you just waited here for me? If I didn't come. Waited for you? Who do you think you are? Rattlesnake sneered and interrupted Duke. We are waiting for your current master. The Mikado and Chaos His Highness made a big bet for him. As for you? Do you think that anyone will care if you die? She looked at Duke with a cold smile, and then turned her eyes to Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan looked at her calmly. I don't like your face, Rattlesnake said with a disgusted look, and then she suggested viciously, Your Highness, kill Duke and Horsewoman and bring Li Tianlan back. Maybe you should seriously consider who your wife is. Dongqing Rushi and the Border Control Corps are good, but aren't Qin Weibai and Samsara a better choice? Prince Renwu's eyes suddenly lit up. Qin Weibai. She was truly a goddess-like figure. Would she be his princess? At this moment, Prince Renwu actually felt very honored. He knew that this plan was feasible. They might not be sure about Li Tianlan's position in the heart of the Master of Samsara Palace, but they were sure about Li Tianlan's position in Qin Weibai's heart. Capturing Li Tianlan would bring great benefits to the overall situation of East Island and Prince Renwu's future. In their plan, Li Tianlan was even one of the key points to instigate the Samsara. What do you think? Prince Renwu was tempted, and he actually looked at Li Tianlan, wanting to know his opinion with great interest. I think you're going to die. Li Tianlan looked at Prince Renwu with pity in his eyes, as if he was looking at a dead man. More and more elites of East Island gathered around, and there were at least hundreds of them. Enough elites, absolute superiors. Who could kill him? Duke glanced at the superiors in front of him, and then looked at the crowd around him. His expressionless face gradually showed a hint of a smile. Anyone else? He suddenly asked. Prince Renwu sneered. When he was about to give Duke another surprise, someone gave him a surprise. No more. A clear Chinese voice rang out in the forest, and it spread all over the place. Prince Renwu's face suddenly froze and he suddenly turned around. In his sight, a white shadow was getting clearer and clearer in the dark, and it was getting closer and closer. Everyone's eyes instantly focused on the man in white who was getting closer and closer. A man who was so handsome that people couldn't tell his age walked over slowly, and his smile was lazy with a kind of careless calmness. Li Tianlan slightly raised his eyebrows. At the first sight of him, Li Tianlan thought of someone. Daybreak. Both of them dressed in the same style, and both of them were extremely handsome, but their temperaments were completely opposite. Daybreak's temperament was strange and cold, and it was enough to frighten anyone. But the man in white in front of him had a sense of laziness all over him. He walked through the messy battlefield, but he was careless as if he was having a holiday by the sea. In his sight, the man in white seemed to raise his hand. In the whistling sound, a few ball-shaped objects flew over, fell on the ground and rolled slightly. Look, they're all here. They're really gone. Prince Renwu's face instantly turned livid. Others' faces also changed. Human heads. There were 4 of them and all of them were bloody human heads. They were the other 4 thunder-shocking realm experts who were lying in ambush in the forest. 2 of them were from the Divine Wind Force, 1 was from the Royal Family, and the last one was from Night Spirit. 4 thunder-shocking realm experts, plus the real experts like them and many elites. There was no reason for them to fail to encircle the 2 supermasters of Samsara. But right now, the heads of the 4 thunder-shocking realm experts were taken away without a sound. Prince Renwu felt cold all over. He suddenly raised his head, looked at the man in white in front of him and said coldly, Who are you? Dawn. The man in white smiled and said, I'm Dawn. Dawn broke. Li Tianlan murmured in his heart. After knowing the news about Li Badian and others, Duke had contacted the extremely mysterious ally of Samsara, and the other party also promised to send someone to pick them up. But who knew that it was such a super expert who came? The heads of the 4 thunder-shocking realm experts were still rolling, and the whole night seemed to become extremely cold and cruel. The atmosphere suddenly froze. Then it was instantly broken by a sharp scream. Kill? Beside Prince Renwu, Rattlesnake suddenly screamed and directly rushed to Li Tianlan. This was their most important goal tonight. They hunted for several days just for this moment. Almost at the same time, Tianyu and Bai Yi directly stood in front of Dawn. Holy light rushed to Duke. A large piece of blue light instantly bloomed in the forest. Rattlesnake's figure had directly rushed to Li Tianlan. In the curtain of rain, the wind suddenly rose. Li Tianlan's eyes focused, and a shadow had already appeared behind him. But before he had time to change his position, the wind had already roared. The wind instantly blew away Li Tianlan's shadow. At the same time, the lightning around Rattlesnake was also blown away. Rattlesnake's expression changed dramatically, and for a moment she didn't dare to move forward. In her perception, there seemed to be an irresistible force firmly locking her in the extremely distant sky. That force was cold and overbearing, with a momentum that could destroy everything. The wind rose but there was no sound. Strange whistling sounds were everywhere in the air. It was like countless unsheathed swords were flying in the sky, fierce and crazy. Sword intent. That was the sword intent that was so huge that it could cover the sky, and it was continuous. The almost invincible sword intent formed hundreds of meters away, and directly pressed over with a momentum as mighty as thunder. The whistling sounds in the air were getting louder and louder. Wherever the sword intent passed, countless turf and trees were all broken. Large pieces of debris were wrapped by the sword intent and flew straight to Rattlesnake. There seemed to be a storm that swept away everything in the forest. It was rampaging and the sword intent was like a dragon. Fast. The vast and heavy sword intent was like a flash of light. Before the whistling sound of the wind faded away. The sword intent mixed with large pieces of turf and trees had already swept the whole area hundreds of meters away. The wind stopped. The sword intent disappeared. In the silence, Rattlesnake stood where she was, and her beautiful face was full of horror. Under everyone's focused gaze, the remnant of the night creatures let out a shrill scream. There seemed to be infinite sword intent breaking out in her body. In an instant, blood and flesh were flying all over the sky. Chapter 181. The bloody mist flew into the air in the deep night, and the scream of Rattlesnake still lingered in the air. The grand sword intent that swept hundreds of meters in an instant had dissipated. Everything was so fast that it seemed to be an illusion. Only the bloody mist all over the sky proved what had just happened. Blood, flesh, bones, and internal organs. That domineering sword intent charged forward, and everything in its path was crushed into powder. Rattlesnake. Rattlesnake, who used to be the top general of Night Spirit, vaguely surpassed the peak of the Thundershocking realm and was infinitely close to the half-step invincible realm, was the first to bear the brunt of this peak sword intent. The night wind blew and the fine rain fell. The bloody mist in the air floated for a moment and disappeared directly. There seemed to be no trace of Rattlesnake in the whole forest. Insta-kill. And it was insta-kill from hundreds of meters away. Rattlesnake, who was close to the half-step invincible realm, burst into a bloody mist without the slightest ability to fight back. How terrifying was the person who used the sword. Saint. An extremely angry roar suddenly sounded. The broken red robe of Tianyu, the high priest of Ayase Grand Shrine, swelled violently. In the blink of an eye, the injury caused by the poison was forcibly suppressed by him. Tianyu's face was strangely pale, but his soaring momentum returned to the peak in an instant. About 3 years ago he had a fight with Saint in Dongdu. The extreme and aggressive sword intent was unforgettable. 3 years later, when the mighty sword intent swept over the battlefield and instantly killed Rattlesnake, he almost recognized the origin of the sword intent at once. Saint of Samsara Palace, the head of the 12 Supermasters, was one of the superiors of the half-step invincible realm who was closest to the invincible realm in the dark world. Half a step, 1 step, half a step, above the Thundershocking realm and below the invincible realm. The subtle gap was completely vast. Both of them were at the half-step invincible realm, but 1 step was enough to determine the winner. Tianyu, the high priest, was a superior of the half-step invincible realm. 3 years ago when he fought with Saint, he was defeated. Today, 3 years later, although his state did not decline, his body was weaker with the passage of time. Saint was not old, at least he still had a glimmer of hope to reach the invincible realm. Tianyu himself was faintly regressing. Saint, on the other hand, had been progressing by leaps and bounds. The gap between them would only get bigger and bigger. Therefore, before Saint got close to the battlefield, Tianyu directly suppressed the poison in his body. He forcibly raised his state to the half-step invincible realm at the cost of being seriously injured. Kill? Tianyu let out a wild roar. Without holding anything back, he stretched out his arms and made a hugging gesture. There was a faint sound of thunder in the air. A large area of air exploded around him, and the twisted airflow formed a tearing wind, sweeping up everything within a radius of more than 10 meters. An astonishing lightning suddenly lit up in his arms, and the lightning twisted and intertwined in his arms, instantly turning into a ball-shaped object. In front of Tianyu was the white-clothed Dawn. Beside him, Bai Yi was also dressed in white. All of a sudden the white robe disappeared. Bai Ye's body disappeared in an instant. The sharp sound of the sword cutting through the air rang out, and with a slight flicker of lightning, it rushed straight to the Dawn. Bai Ye's body disappeared, leaving only the sword intent in the air. Limitless Palace's secret technique. Dark ambush. This wasn't the most powerful move of Limitless Palace, but it was regarded as the real essence of what Tianhai Wuji had learned in his life. Tianhai Wuji was the most powerful saber grandmaster in East Island, but this move was the real sword reigning move. The core of this move was dissipation. The sword intent condensed. The figure dissipated. In an instant, Bai Ye's figure seemed to really disappear from this world. Only the sword edge cut through the air and the sword light rolled down. Dawn didn't fight back and he couldn't. Under the dark ambush, Bai Ye's figure really disappeared. There was only his sword in the air and no attack could fall on him. The sword light and the lightning fell. A few meters in front of him, the light ball in Tianyu's arms suddenly exploded. There were surging lightning everywhere, swallowing and destroying everything. The lightning rushed over the place where Bai Yi was just now, and spread to all the surrounding space. It rushed over. This was one of the most powerful final moves of ISE Grand Shrine. Dark Sacrifice. In the blink of an eye, Bai Yi and Tianyu attacked at the same time, and they used all their strength. The sword intent and the lightning shone in the sky, and the surging and violent killing intent directly covered Dawn in white. None of them were fools. Bai Yi and Tianyu weren't. Holy Light wasn't. Prince Renwu wasn't. Duke Horsewoman, Li Tianlan wasn't either. How was the power difference on the spot? Dawn was a real superior of the half-step invincible realm. Duke was also infinitely close to this level. Among the 12 super masters of Samsara, there was a jura between Horsewoman and Duke. Her strength wasn't as good as Duke, but it wasn't far behind. An ordinary expert at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm couldn't become one of the super masters of Samsara Palace. Li Tianlan was injured now, so his combat capability was the worst. But after taking the Surge Potion from North America, his strength would stay in the fire-flaming realm for 3 months. Tribulation's Buddhist incantation of 9 words, the Li family's map of God of War and Wind and Thunder veins, his capital was extremely strong. In this state, Li Tianlan could kill an ordinary superior of the thunder-shocking realm, and he could protect himself in front of an expert at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. As the enemy, East Island did have the advantage in strength. Tianyu and Holy Light from Northern Europe were both standard experts of the half-step invincible realm. Bai Yi wasn't weaker than Duke. Prince Renwu was also in the thunder-shocking realm. Although he hadn't reached the peak, his combat capability was definitely not bad. Plus, there were hundreds of East Island elites around. They had nothing to fear and were full of confidence. But the appearance of Saint instantly broke the power difference between the two sides. In the blink of an eye, the grand sword intent spanning hundreds of meters killed Rattlesnake with one strike. Such strength completely showed the strength of the first supermaster of Samsara Palace. Tianyu had passed the peak. Even Holy Light, who was still in the peak, thought that he couldn't do this. But everyone knew that Saint hadn't really reached the invincible realm. The sword strike just now, in terms of scene, wasn't even as good as Dongqing Rushi's flying fairy from outer space. But in terms of power, it was close to the strike of an invincible realm expert. Killing Rattlesnake from hundreds of meters away was definitely Saint's full effort. This seemed to be overbearing and chilling, but how could Saint not pay any price? At least he would be weak for a short time. Saint's weak state and the distance of hundreds of meters was the best chance for East Island. As long as they could catch Li Tianlan in this short time, even if Duke Horsewoman and the other young people didn't die, as long as they defeated them and caught Li Tianlan, their operation wouldn't be considered a failure. If they waited until Saint recovered from his weak state and rushed to the scene, it wouldn't be a problem of failure anymore. None of them would probably be able to leave. It was a race against time. For a moment, everyone in the forest went completely crazy and went all out. Tianyu and Bai Yi fought hard again. Holy Light was also fighting hard. As the leader of Knights Templars who came to East Island this time, his sense of urgency and pressure was no less than that of East Island. The reason was naturally because of Samsara. Samsara Palace. This was one of the most mysterious dark superpowers in the dark world. No one knew where their headquarters was, but they vaguely knew that they had a great influence in Europe. The headquarters of Knights Templars was in Northern Europe, and their biggest backer, the Vatican, was also in Europe. In the past few years, Northern Europe had always been the most lively place in the dark world. Knights Templars claimed to be the chosen ones of God, with the will of the Vatican, and regarded dark knights as heresy. Knight Spirit, whose headquarters was in Billy State, tried to fish in troubled waters. People of Samsara Palace appeared and disappeared from time to time, and it was unclear whether they were enemies or allies. The Wang family of Beihai, the Jiang family of South America Fantasy World, and other large and small dark superpowers also had their own demands. In countless dark corners of Northern Europe, there were fights and killings almost every day. Now the dark world was going to change dramatically. Although the battlefield was in East Island, the starting point was also in Northern Europe. Night Spirit was destroyed. In the entire Northern Europe, the most deeply rooted superpowers were Samsara, Knights Templars, and Dark Knights. But on the day of the final battle in Zhongzhou State, Samsara and Dark Knights showed an unexpectedly close cooperative relationship, which made the whole Knights Templars nervous. If this situation continued, there would be no room for Knights Templars to survive in Northern Europe in the future. Mortal enemy. Being on the side of heretics meant being a mortal enemy. So, Holy Light came to East Island and stood in the camp of East Island to fight against Samsara and Zhongzhou State. This was a cooperation that concerned the overall situation. Holy Light's mind was extremely pure. For his ally he would go all out. He was moving forward. Duke was retreating. There were surging airflows everywhere. In the darkness, Holy Light's golden hair was shaking rapidly, and a dazzling light burst out around him. The faint blue electric arc went straight up to the sky, and Holy Light himself seemed to be plated with a layer of golden light. Holy and majestic. It seemed to be the power of faith, firm and unshakable. Heretics, go to hell. In the furious roar, Holy Light punched out. He didn't hide it at all. This was the martial arts of the Vatican. Holy punishment. Behind the Duke there were messy lightning bolts everywhere. The lightning bolts flickered and spread out with extreme power. Facing the Holy Light's divine punishment, the Duke retreated even faster, but the lightning bolts behind him suddenly stopped. Two thin but extremely dangerous electric arcs suddenly burst out from the thunderbolts behind him, vicious and cold. Thanks. Suddenly there was a trace of blood in the air. It was like the collision between holiness and evil. The indistinct golden and blood-colored electric arcs intertwined and collided. Blood flew out from Holy Light's shoulder, and Duke, who was a little weaker, was directly punched out. Holy Light, whose shoulder had exposed the ghastly white bones, had no pain in his eyes, only a kind of fanaticism that ordinary people couldn't understand. Heretics. In the roar, his body rose into the air, chasing after Duke, and he jumped down from the air. Unique technique. Judgment. Duke was fighting. Horsewoman was guarding. Horsewoman, whose code name was Horsewoman, seemed to be more like a guardian. Several unconscious young people on the ground had been put together by Horsewoman. There were gunshots from all directions and all kinds of bullets swept all the areas around Horsewoman. In sight, one elite after another rushed up. Ice-condensing realm, fire-flaming realm. Their strength might not be strong, but the sense of oppression when they rushed up together was far more than that of a single thundershocking realm expert. The knight's expression was calm. Bright electric arcs with some sparks intertwined around her, forming an almost impenetrable electric net. Countless bullets hit the net and were melted without a sound. The elites around her were getting closer and closer. The light of the ice edge and the raging fire was faintly shining in her eyes, becoming clearer and clearer. Horsewoman took a deep breath. Looking at the elites getting closer and closer, she suddenly lowered her body. She clenched her fists. She clenched her fists, which looked very delicate, and punched the ground. Boom. The electric net around her exploded instantly, and countless electric arcs spread out, forming a natural circle. There were crackling sounds everywhere in the air, and the shock wave composed of pure electric light spread to every corner around. A large number of East Island elites were blown away as if they were struck by lightning. The electric light spread and then gathered. Horsewoman was expressionless, but her eyes were observing Li Tianlan intentionally or unintentionally. She could die, but nothing could happen to Li Tianlan. Horsewoman pursed her lips and her face looked cruel. Even she could die. At the critical moment, Duke, Don, Dongqing Rushi, Li Badian, Ning Chenqing, everyone could die. Switch positions. The moment Rattlesnake's body exploded, Li Tianlan entered the strongest fighting state almost without any hesitation. Three shadows appeared almost at the same time, and the distance between them was shortened quickly. When Prince Renwu just came back to his senses from the shock, a silver spear had already struck Prince Renwu's head with an unstoppable momentum. Changing the princess? From today on, the royal family of East Island was going to change the prince. The lightning around Prince Renwu suddenly shone. Before he could fight back, the surging light suddenly stopped. Stop formula. The air suddenly became extremely twisted, and everything seemed to be confined. Li Tianlan's eyes were cold. After the stop formula, it was the crack formula. Several shadows followed his real body and rushed to Prince Renwu at the same time. But Prince Renwu's body had disappeared in an instant. Only the invisible sword intent approached Li Tianlan quickly, bursting out the blue electric light all over the sky. The unique technique of Wuji Palace. Dark ambush. Li Tianlan's expression didn't change at all. He still started with the crack formula, and the human emperor instantly turned into two swords. The raging fire surged up to the sky in an instant, and the forest seemed to be filled with raging fire. The eighth blade burns the sky. The surging lightning danced all over the sky. From the corner of his eyes, two figures in white seemed to appear in the large amount of falling lightning at the same time. In front of the figures in white, High Priest Tianyu, whose red robe was almost completely torn, had already flown out with a large amount of blood. The white clothes were stained with blood. Under Bai Ye's ambush, Dawn, who had taken almost all of Tianyu's attacks, was covered with blood. Some belonged to Bai Ye, some belonged to Tianyu, and some belonged to himself. The fiercest confrontation without any reservation. So the battle seemed to be over as soon as it started. Dawn's body shook slightly and his breath became weak. But Tianyu's body flew backward for at least 30 or 40 meters, fell on the ground and didn't make any sound. Tianyu, you're old. Dawn's eyes were cold. He looked at the place where Tianyu fell and said expressionlessly. Bai Ye's figure had already appeared. In a split second he seemed to have dodged all of Dawn's attacks, and his whole body was still in the most perfect state. But he didn't look very excited. Instead he looked more and more serious. When he joined hands with Tianyu, his power was almost equal to that of two half-step invincible realm experts. There was a gap, but it wouldn't be too big. But at that moment this super expert who came out of nowhere didn't use any unique skill. The attacks he dodged seemed to be the most common ones. Who the hell was he? Where did he come from? Bai Ye's eyes were completely focused. Looking at Dawn's weak and tired face, he looked serious and raised the long and narrow samurai sword in his hand. A touch of green light bloomed on the blade of the samurai sword. In a split second, there seemed to be a strong wind whistling, blowing up Bai Ye's white robe. He raised the sword. He sprinted. The green sword light filled the nearby forest in the blink of an eye. The sword light suppressed all the lightning. Fast. As fast as lightning. Before the first sword fell, another sword was raised. It was an indescribable swiftness. Bai Ye's body was like a crazy demon. Not only the sword was fast, but also his speed seemed to suddenly increase, directly reaching the level of half-step invincible realm. The saber light flew out at a speed that dazzled everyone's eyes, covering everything in its path. Under the sword light, everything seemed to be destroyed. The strongest unique skill of Wuji Palace. The fastest sword in the dark world. Chapter 182. There had never been a perfect unique skill of martial arts in this world. Imperfection was not a weakness, but it was a shortcoming in some aspects. Perfect was martial arts, and the so-called unique skill was the pursuit of power in some aspects of martial arts. For example, extreme speed, extreme explosive power, extreme sword energy, or extreme defense. In the process of pursuing the extreme you had to give up something. When you couldn't take care of everything, then you could focus and reach the extreme. The map of God of War of the Li family was like that. The 6 paths of reincarnation of the Wang family of Beihai was like that. The unique skill of Wuji Palace was like that. Dark ambush. The essence of this move was the ambush, but it was also the darkness. This was known as the quintessence of Wuji Palace, and it was indeed amazing. When Prince Renwu's figure disappeared in front of him, Li Tianlan couldn't locate him at all. The figure disappeared, the sword light disappeared, and the lightning disappeared. Everything in front of him seemed to turn into nothingness in an instant, and only the killing intent was real. It seemed like there were countless swords chopping in the air, and the sharp sound came from far away. Prince Renwu's body became completely illusory, and the sound of the long sword chopping in the air suddenly became louder. The bright sword light flashed and a large amount of lightning poured down. Prince Renwu's figure was still nowhere to be seen. Li Tianlan couldn't understand the martial arts principles of such a unique skill, and he didn't bother to think about it. The lightning poured down from above, and the fire suddenly soared into the sky. The 8th blade of flaming sky. Right beside him. The 2 shadows moved at the same time. They raised their swords and spun. Under the wet rain, the air within dozens of meters suddenly became extremely dry. The flames rose on the ground and covered everything around. The sword light and the lightning intertwined. Looking from a distance, Li Tianlan seemed to be surrounded by a huge and expanding fireball. The moment the lightning and the fire intertwined, the fireball seemed to be greatly stimulated. After an extreme expansion, all the fire exploded. The fire was like a tide. The raging fire waves ravaged every corner within dozens of meters. Li Tianlan's face was cold and his essence, qi and spirit were completely condensed. In a sense, this was the first time that he exposed his inheritance and unique skill in front of the world. In Huading, he used the 15th blade to kill Gu Changjiang, and Gu Changjiang was already dead. Black Robe's attack, the shattering of mountains and rivers, belonged to the domain of the invincible manual. That sword was also unknown. In Dongdu he killed Miyamoto Shiny Eye. Miyamoto Shiny Eye was already dead. In the face of my Shiranui's pursuit, even at the last moment, Li Tianlan still concealed something. The meteor fire shower of the three swords was completely deformed, leaving only an almost violent power, which would not let others see through it. Right now, the eighth blade burning heaven. The most complete and clearest sword appeared directly in front of everyone. That violent sword intent mixed with raging flames rose from the ground, pervading the heavens and earth, surging like a tide, like a huge wave. The ultimate sword intent was unprecedentedly clear, so clear that there was no concealment at all. That was the strongest sword intent in the entire dark world. Eighth blade. There seemed to be faint golden lightning roaring. In an extremely short amount of time, Holy Light, who had already suppressed the Duke with his full power, suddenly turned around. His almost frenzied attacks also paused for a moment. This area of less than 200 meters was divided into several battlefields. Which one of the people present was not an expert? The moment the flames of the eighth blade rose, the familiar and strange sword intent had already swept across the battlefield. The unconcealed sword intent was so obvious that it was almost dazzling. Sure enough, the cold light in Holy Light's eyes flashed away. He muttered to himself. Before he could do anything else, Duke, who was more and more struggling in the battle and could only defend, suddenly pounced on him. His sight was full of blue. The blue and somewhat black lightning completely condensed in the hands of the Duke, like two sharp knives, and fiercely stabbed the chest of Holy Light. The lightning roared around him as he moved. It was raining, but the whole battlefield was as dry as a desert. The lightning exploded on the ground, splashing a lot of smoke and dust. In a blur, Duke's scarlet eyes were full of the purest evil and coldness. The two electric knives instantly cut through Holy Light's clothes. Then he continued to move forward. Unique skill, bloodthirsty. The whole battlefield was moving. Horsewoman was responsible for guarding the wounded. A large number of East Island elites pounced on her one after another. The range of Horsewoman's activity was getting smaller and smaller, but the lightning around her was getting denser and denser. More and more East Island elites fell on the way of the charge. Horsewoman's dignified face gradually turned pale. When her willpower was exhausted, her physical strength and combat effectiveness began to plummet. That was the saying, ants can bite an elephant to death. Bai Yi and Tianyu teamed up to besiege Dawn. In an instant the outcome was clear. Tianyu flew backward with a lot of blood flying around. But Bai Yi, who was close to him, seemed to have fallen into madness. The mountain fell and the earth cracked. The dark green saber light spun and splashed in the battlefield. The strong airflow drove the roaring lightning, which had almost completely covered Dawn. Fast. Pure fast. It was indescribably fast. Every strike seemed to be fatal. This was the strongest unique skill of Wuji Palace. It didn't look fancy, even a little simple, but the fast and violent blade was enough to cut everything. It was the perfect combination of strength and speed. It was steady, accurate, ruthless, invincible, and unbreakable. Two white shadows intertwined with each other, one advancing and the other retreating. Fast. Faster and faster. Dawn's pupils had become completely bright. He had completely put away his previous careless attitude. Facing the blade that had vaguely surpassed the peak of the thunder-shocking realm, he didn't even have the slightest defense when he advanced and retreated. He moved like a flying dragon. He didn't have any weapons, but his body was full of weapons. Bolts of lightning surged in front of him one after another, turning into giant sabers and long swords. The weapons condensed from lightning shot toward Bai Yi without hesitation, accurately blocking each of his sabers and then continuing to attack his body. Bai Yi seemed to be attacking wildly, but in fact he was already in a semi-defensive state. But Dawn didn't defend from the beginning to the end, he just attacked wildly. It was an incomprehensible momentum, crazy and fanatical, and he wouldn't retreat until he died. While advancing and retreating, Bai Yi, who was holding the saber with both hands but bleeding between his thumb and index finger, suddenly roared. The muscles all over his body bulged, and the white robe all over his body exploded in an instant. The long saber chopped down. In an instant, all the lightning completely condensed on the blade. The long saber, which seemed to be able to cut the air into two halves, emitted dark green saber energy and completely suppressed the lightning on the blade. There seemed to be only dark green left in the whole world. A strike with all his strength. Mountain collapsing and ground cracking. Broken blade. Bai Ye's pupils had already condensed into one point. At this moment he also completely gave up all defense, and attacking and killing became his most instinctive desire. The dark green saber energy suppressed the lightning, bursting out from all over his body. All the strength was concentrated in his arms as he sprinted forward with small steps. Even if the saber broke, even if he died. At all costs. At this moment, Bai Ye's strength was still infinitely close to the half-step invincible realm, but the power of this strike had firmly reached the half-step invincible realm. The blade that was raised above his head had already fallen down, and there seemed to be thousands of sabers chopping down in the air at the same time. In his perception, apart from the blade, there seemed to be only death. The dark green saber energy whistled wildly, covering the battlefield between Bai Yi and Dawn. The saber energy kept gathering and flying in all directions. The two figures were completely shrouded in the saber energy, completely blurring for a moment. Boom! The surging, almost crazy saber energy finally broke out completely. The ground dozens of meters nearby suddenly sank down, and the roots of some trees deeply buried in the ground were shaken into the air. The saber energy was violently twisted. In the blurred scene, Bai Ye's unwilling and furious roar was so high and so weak. A white figure flew up into the air with a lot of blood. The drops of blood fell with the rain, which was shocking. On the battlefield where the ground had sunk for nearly half a meter, Dawn stood where he was, putting his palms together. A broken saber was tightly clamped between his palms. His expression was indifferent, and he let the blood flow between his hands without saying a word. Bai Ye's body was still rising in the air. He held the half of the long saber in his hand tightly, staring at Dawn on the ground with mixed feelings. At this moment he finally understood why this master with amazing strength whom he had never heard of didn't use a unique technique. He didn't have a unique technique. In other words, every move and every attack of his was a unique technique. Almost at the same time. When Bai Ye's body flew to the highest place, an old and weak but extremely powerful roar suddenly sounded. On the battlefield that seemed to be independent but connected with each other, a man in a scarlet-red robe suddenly jumped up from the ground and rushed to the other direction. The dim blue lightning rose up, and for a moment the dark forest was as bright as day. Tianyu, the high priest of Iasi Grand Shrine. Tianyu, who was defeated by Dawn in a very short time. And the direction he was rushing to, a horsewoman, who had been watching the battlefield closely, suddenly changed her face. That was the direction of Li Tianlan. The sword intent of the eighth blade fell, and there was lightning rising in the fire that hadn't dissipated yet. Prince Renwu's figure got close to Li Tianlan silently. The long saber swept across. And Tianyu's figure was still sprinting at a high speed. In an instant he was less than 10 meters away from Li Tianlan. In the fierce battle, everyone didn't forget what their target was. For East Island, Li Tianlan was their target, the most important target, no one else. Tianyu, how dare you? Dawn, who still put his palms together, looked pale, but his expression instantly turned furious. Swish. Almost no one could see his movement clearly. Dawn, who was dressed in white, suddenly rose up into the sky. In the blink of an eye, his figure had already jumped up into the sky and became a small white dot. Tianyu's figure was about to get close to Li Tianlan. Less than 5 meters. Horsewoman started sprinting without hesitation. Boom. In the highest place of the firmament, there was a faint loud noise like thunder. The wind and clouds changed. The gloomy sky seemed to start spinning in a trance. The white figure who rose up into the sky fell rapidly from the high sky, with pale lightning and endless killing intent. Above the 9th heaven the thunder was about to strike, and the thunder was rolling as if the sky was angry. A majestic and cold voice came from the high sky, with extreme anger. The cage of heaven and earth. Swish. Endless lightning fell directly from the high sky to the ground like a falling river and sea, running between the sky and the earth. Tianyu was less than 3 meters away from Li Tianlan. But the distance of 3 meters was like a mote. His body suddenly froze on the spot. In the endless lightning, he struggled to raise his hand bit by bit as if in slow motion. This was the domain. The domain that belonged to the invincible realm. Although it was not perfect, it was really close to the invincible realm. Maybe it was only a paper-thin distance. Dawn's body fell from the sky with endless lightning. Like a god. Ah! Tianyu suddenly screamed. In the cage made of lightning, his body suddenly expanded and a large amount of blood mist burst out. Inside the cage there was a world of lightning. Bang! The lightning lasted for a second and then suddenly exploded. The cage of heaven and earth collapsed. Tianyu, whose aura instantly fell from the half-step invincible realm to the ordinary thunder-shocking realm and was still falling, fled the battlefield as fast as he could without looking back. In the depths of the forest hundreds of meters away, the magnificent sword intent was generated again and swept everything. Same was coming. The situation was over. Holy light gritted his teeth, looked at Duke in front of him unwillingly, turned around suddenly and disappeared quickly. Clang. The human emperor collided with the long saber, and the huge power was transmitted to each other. Prince Renwu's body suddenly shook, and the dazzling lightning covered the saber. Prince Renwu pressed down with all his strength and suddenly released the power. Li Tianlan, who instinctively wanted to throw Prince Renwu away, burst out his power and instantly lifted Prince Renwu's body into the sky. When everyone retreated, the prince didn't have any city wall. The lightning flashed in the sky and his body disappeared again. Dark surprise attack. But this time he didn't use it for surprise attack. He used it directly to escape. The sword intent cut through the air, flashed in the forest and disappeared. Without any hesitation, Li Tianlan directly rushed up. He had the shadow formula, the desperate chase of Sai City, and the night walking of the Li family. In the battle in front of Li Tianlan, if he couldn't defeat him, he would die. Want to escape? What a joke. The sword light fell. Prince Renwu's figure appeared dozens of meters away. Almost at the same second, Li Tianlan had already switched places with his shadow and appeared next to Prince Renwu. Do you think you can escape? He sneered. The human emperor turned into a long spear again, stirred the fire and directly smashed down. Prince Renwu also sneered. He was retreating. When Li Tianlan was about to continue to chase, a familiar and fatal danger instantly enveloped his whole body. This was an absolutely fatal danger. Li Tianlan's pupils instantly contracted. It's too late. At the same time, in the depths of the forest less than 300 meters away from Li Tianlan, a man wearing a top hat chuckled and put his finger directly on the trigger of the gun. The night rain drenched him from head to toe, and even the red scarf around his neck was wet and stuck to the ground. But his movements were still steady. He held the gun with both hands without any tremble. In his sight, Li Tianlan suddenly turned around. Bang! In the gunshot that almost shook the forest, a large wave of fire suddenly rushed out of the muzzle. The wave of fire condensed into a line in the air, and directly rushed to Li Tianlan. Heavenly Calamity. At the same time, Heavenly Calamity heard Li Tianlan's furious voice. 300 meters away, shooting at close range. Heavenly Calamity slightly raised the corner of his mouth with absolute confidence. The hot line of fire burned the forest, and a few East Island elites who didn't have time to retreat were directly smashed by the shot. I blossom in slaughter. Like a flower in the dawn. With a cruel look, Heavenly Calamity stared at Li Tianlan's position. In his sight, flesh and blood were exploding and flying. Only the line of fire was still stable, rushing to Li Tianlan. Heavenly Calamity squinted, turned the muzzle without hesitation, aimed at another angle, and directly pulled the trigger. Chapter 183. A peak assassination. From the initial observation of the target, sneaking in, setting up an ambush, hiding, waiting, looking for an opportunity, finding the shooting angle, planning the retreat route, this series of work often took a lot of time, and all of this was often for the moment of the assassination. In an instant, life and death were decided. For real superiors, life and death were often decided in less than a second. It was too late. When the blazing line of fire smashed the bodies of several East Island elites and rushed straight to Li Tianlan, when the line of fire was still running in the air, Heavenly Calamity already knew that his shot was too slow. This was the perfect angle, the perfect distance, the perfect timing, and the perfect trajectory. But the bullet mixed with the raging fire met an obstacle when it flew in the air. A very small and fragile obstacle. The bodies of several East Island elites were as fragile as glass under the bullet shot from the grim smile. But it was because of these East Island elites that the bullet directly rushed to Li Tianlan a little slower. How much slower? Half a second? 1/3 of a second? Or even less? But this extremely short time was enough for Li Tianlan to make the most instinctive reaction. The bright and blazing flame ran across the whole forest. In the flame, the bullet seemed to have completely disappeared, and only the deafening sound of the gunshot was still echoing. Switch positions. Li Tianlan's figure suddenly disappeared. At the same time, in the grass hundreds of meters away, Heavenly Calamity held the famous gun in his hand, grim smile, and directly changed his position. The gunshot was louder. In Li Tianlan's sight, the whole world was like a volcanic eruption, and all in front of him was erupting magma. Compared with the penetration of the last shot, this shot completely destroyed. The flame roared and rushed in the forest. Li Tianlan's body just changed positions with the shadow, and a large piece of flame had directly kicked in front of him. A silhouette suddenly appeared in front of him, completely blocking his body. The dignified and charming plump figure slightly bent her body, with her palms forward, and opened her hands in a fearless manner. A faint blue light curtain shone from all directions on the ground. The light curtain didn't spread but condensed. Boom! The moment the fire wave hit the light curtain, the whole light curtain had become a huge shield. Absolute protection. Knight of the 12 Supermasters of Samsara, a supermaster who was best at defense. Her unique technique was not outstanding in attack, but in terms of defense, there were not many people in the Thundershocking realm, including some half-step invincible realm experts, who could break her defense directly. The fire and the lightning collided, and the whole forest shook violently. Numerous cracks suddenly appeared on the shield, which had almost been condensed into a substance by the lightning. Raging flames spread from the cracks. Horsewoman's body shook violently, and a large mouthful of blood spurted from the corner of her mouth. But she did not care about her injury at all. She just stood in front of Li Tianlan, trembling all over but not taking a step back. Even if she had to die, she would die in front of him. Be careful. Horsewoman's tone was weak. For the first time since she met Li Tianlan, there was a hint of hopeless helplessness and panic on her face. Heavenly Calamity, the top killer in the dark world, held 2 famous guns in his hands, one whispering and the other grinning. Samsara's information on Calamity wasn't much, but it definitely wasn't little. 2 famous guns made Heavenly Calamity, and Heavenly Calamity also made 2 famous guns. Whisper was a pistol with a fast shooting speed and a large magazine capacity. It was a self-defense weapon for close combat. It was also the gun that Heavenly Calamity used the least. Whisper was dusty because of the grinning. Grinning was a sniper rifle, and in terms of power, it was definitely one of the most powerful sniper rifles under the 12 murderous weapons. Most importantly, this gun could shoot continuously after temporary modification. 3 shots in a row. This was Heavenly Calamity's trump card. With his muzzle, after 3 shots in a row, there were very few targets who could stand in front of him, whether the target was in the Thundershocking realm or the Fire-Flaming realm. This kind of temporary modification was said to seriously damage a certain part of Grinning's body. In short, it burned money, so Heavenly Calamity rarely used it. But now the second shot had broken Horsewoman's shield. Where was the third shot? Horsewoman's mind was blank. Who on earth wanted to kill Li Tianlan? All kinds of thoughts flashed crazily in her mind. Facing the coming third shot, she had no choice but to grit her teeth and fight to the death. The first shot and the second shot sounded almost at the same time. The loud gunshots echoed in the forest for a long time. Duke was already seriously injured and powerless. Don was still standing there, but no one knew what he was thinking, and his eyes became a little dazed. Hundreds of meters away, the enormous sword intent in the forest was approaching quickly. The third shot was about to rush out of the barrel. Horsewoman clenched her teeth, and her body shook violently. With a slight sound, a large amount of blood spurted from her body into the air like a fountain. The blood and the lightning intertwined and dripped on the shield that seemed to have been condensed into a substance by the lightning. The flames in the cracks were forcibly dispelled. At a glance, the lightning in front of Horsewoman had become extremely ghastly scarlet, indescribably tragic. Suddenly, Li Tianlan's eyes turned red. It's useless. In the grass hundreds of meters away, through the sniper scope, Heavenly Calamity stared at the intertwining red and blue lightning in front of him with cold eyes. A trace of a confident smile with an extremely bloody smell appeared at the corner of his mouth. Knowing your importance, how could I not make preparations? After a short but suffocating pause, Heavenly Calamity directly took out a scarlet bullet from his sleeve. The bullet was elegant and long, with sharp edges faintly visible. It was like a blood-stained scarlet color with a strong smell of death. The bullet was called God Destroyer. For many years, Heavenly Calamity had worked hard to get 3. This was a big gift, not only for Li Tianlan, but also for the superiors of the half-step invincible realm present. The bullet was pressed into the barrel. Holding a grim smile, Heavenly Calamity's smile was ferocious. In his sight, Horsewoman's blood seemed to dye every bolt of lightning red. Her body was shaking, and the shield in front of her became pure blood red. Interesting. He spoke softly, put his finger on the trigger, concentrated, and shot. Heavenly Calamity. All of a sudden, a roar came from behind the blood-red shield. It was an indescribable roar, with a rage that was completely beyond reason. Endless fierceness seemed to condense into one point in an instant. Li Tianlan's figure directly rushed out of the blood-red light curtain. As the lightning roared, the blood-red shield in front of Horsewoman was smashed, and countless beads of blood rolled back to Horsewoman's body. Li Tianlan brushed past Horsewoman and took her body to the side. In an instant, through the sniper scope, Heavenly Calamity only saw a pair of blood-red eyes with extreme madness. Indifference, ghastly, and resentment. That was a pair of eyes without any human emotions, only negative emotions, scarlet and weird. Speed up. Run wildly. Sprint. Li Tianlan's figure rushed straight over, with complete rage and madness, like a completely enraged beast. All the matter in the world seemed to disappear in an instant. The lightning behind Li Tianlan had completely dissipated. There was no sword intent, no raging fire. There was only a kind of killing intent that was so strong that it made people unable to breathe between heaven and earth. There was no medium, only the most primitive, most naked, and most ferocious killing intent. Gotcha. 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 Strange noises kept ringing out. Heavenly Calamity suddenly came to his senses. In a trance, the extremely precious god of destruction in the gun had already been unconsciously shot out by him. This most precious trump card was not aimed, so the accuracy could be imagined. But Heavenly Calamity had no time to care about the pain. In his sight, Li Tianlan's figure rushed over at an incomprehensible speed. At the same angle, in a completely straight line. There seemed to be no weapon in his hand. He was just a person. Indomitable and invincible. Several thick trees that needed several people to hug were in front of him, but he didn't change his direction at all. He just rushed over. The branches and leaves all over the sky shook wildly, and the thick trunks broke into countless sawdust. As the sawdust flew, Li Tianlan's speed was getting faster and faster. That furious roar seemed to have not dissipated, and Li Tianlan had already rushed over half the distance. At this moment, Heavenly Calamity's heart was cold. Fear, even panic, instantly occupied his mind. He held the grim smile in his hand tightly and kept pulling the trigger, but his whole body didn't dare to move. He had never seen a charge in such a situation, and he had never felt such a fierce sense of oppression. Li Tianlan was getting closer and closer, and everything in front of him was smashed into pieces. His reason kept reminding Heavenly Calamity that the person in front of him was just a fire-flaming realm young man, and his real realm was only in the ice-condensing realm. But the figure that was crazily approaching in his sight was like a demon in his perception. The sword light in front of him scattered. In a very short time, Prince Renwu, who was also desperately running, finally got close to Heavenly Calamity. He didn't even have time to breathe but pulled Heavenly Calamity up and shouted in a low voice, "Go!" Heavenly Calamity seemed to wake up from a dream, and he suddenly got up from the ground. But he felt his limbs were so weak that he almost fell down again. That extremely crazy killing intent seemed to be getting closer and closer. He shook his head fiercely, put the grim smile on his back and said in a deep voice, "Go!" Shadow Formula. Desperate Chase. Dark Night Walking. His speed was getting faster and faster, and everything in his sight became blurred. The road ahead was moving backward quickly, and the rain and the strong wind fell on his face and body, making him feel pain all over his body. The pain came from inside to outside. The strong wind was howling around his ears. But Li Tianlan could still clearly feel that the bones in his body were making sounds as if they couldn't bear the heavy load. He used all the unique skills that could speed up. Li Tianlan almost didn't care about anything. He shortened the distance between them. His realm was rising crazily from the fire-flaming realm to the stabilization phase of the fire-flaming realm, to the peak phase and still rising. His will, which was as firm as iron, was burning crazily. Vaguely, Li Tianlan seemed to feel that he had become an extremely fierce momentum. Everything in the world, including everything in front of him, was smashed into pieces. His momentum kept rising crazily, and his killing intent became more and more turbulent, going straight up to the sky. In the twinkling of an eye, Li Tianlan's soaring momentum suddenly fell straight down, but his killing intent was still rising. His realm, which had reached the critical point of the thunder-shocking realm, declined rapidly, falling from the peak of the fire-flaming realm to the initial fire-flaming realm in the blink of an eye. The bottle of surge potion from North America seemed to have lost its effect. His realm fell from the fire-flaming realm to the ice-condensing realm in a flash, and then continued to fall directly into the chi-controlling realm. Li Tianlan didn't know it. But his falling realm was stabilized at the level of the fulfillment of the chi-controlling realm, and then continued to rise at an almost violent speed. He entered the ice-condensing realm. After the stabilization phase of the ice-condensing realm stabilized a little, almost in an instant he returned to the state close to the thunder-shocking realm. He broke through. Li Tianlan finally came to his senses. The darkness in front of him seemed to become clearer, and the pain in his body was greatly reduced. Vaguely, his third shadow seemed to have a closer connection with him. The path after the fulfillment of the chi-controlling realm went further. At the same time, the ice-condensing realm also officially entered the stabilization phase. Li Tianlan slowed down a little, but his speed increased in an instant. He was happy that there was no breakthrough. The rage in his heart, which seemed to want to kill everything, became clearer. The rage came from Horsewoman. There was no friendship between him and Horsewoman. Horsewoman risked her life to protect him only because of Qin Weibai's order. But it didn't matter to Li Tianlan. At that moment, when the blood-colored shield took shape, he could clearly feel Horsewoman's determination to die. He didn't want to owe this kind of life-risking kindness because he already owed a lot of people and he couldn't afford to pay them back. The rage also came from his pride. He had the strongest physique, the most powerful inheritance, and the most outstanding environment. He was the heavenly son of the world, not King wretch who needed others to stand in his way. Heavenly Calamity had attacked him once and now he dared to attack him again? Heavenly Calamity. You want to kill me? Who do you think you are? The extreme rage made Li Tianlan's eyes completely red. He had completely lost his reason and all that was left in his mind was killing. Prince Renwu was running wildly. Heavenly Calamity was also running wildly. But the distance between them was instantly shortened. 50 meters. 30 meters. 20 meters. Li Tianlan suddenly let out a long roar. His body leaped into the air, and he threw himself at the back of Heavenly Calamity, who looked extremely thin. Your Highness, take care. On the ground, Heavenly Calamity felt the absolutely fatal danger, so he gritted his teeth and said that. Li Tianlan was getting closer and closer. Heavenly Calamity casually took out a grenade-like thing and threw it into the air. At the same time, his body directly accelerated, and he instantly surpassed Prince Renwu. As a superior of the thunder-shocking realm who had killed many people of the fire-flaming realm when he was only in the fire-flaming realm, how could he only have a whisper to protect himself when he was approached? This grenade wasn't very lethal, but it was also a powerful weapon that could help him get out of danger. As for Prince Renwu, he wasn't Heavenly Calamity's employer on this trip to East Island, or even the whole East Island. The reason why they cooperated tonight was because they helped him get out of the chase once. Now that they had done that, Heavenly Calamity didn't care about the ending. Another 500 meters ahead. He would be absolutely safe. Heavenly Calamity, you. Prince Renwu's expression changed dramatically. That grenade flew into the air and a silver light flashed in the air. The human emperor turned into a long spear and directly blew up the grenade. In an instant, countless shrapnel flew up along with a large amount of fire, and an extremely condensed impact instantly hit the space within a dozen meters nearby. The air was violently twisted, and the airflow was turbulent. Li Tianlan suddenly slowed down like he was suddenly hit by a strong wind. In the storm, Prince Renwu staggered, and his eyes were gloomy and ferocious. He was very clear that Heavenly Calamity was Li Tianlan's target, and so was he. Now Tianyu escaped with serious injuries, Holy Light left, and Bai Yi also escaped. He was the only one left. But he was behind Tianyu. How could he die? Prince Renwu's expression became more and more ferocious and twisted. He was a nephew who was highly valued by the Mikado. Among the princes in Country R, his position was only second to the crown prince. After Night Spirit was destroyed, East Island wanted to use the Shinto power and the remaining foundation of Night Spirit to support a new superpower to replace Night Spirit's position. Prince Renwu, who was extremely talented in martial arts, became the most obvious candidate. He still had a very exciting future, so how could he die here? At this moment, the prince's heart was filled with ferociousness, but there was only regret in his heart. If he didn't chase after Dongqing Rushi? If he didn't want the border Praetorian Corps of Zhongzhou State to become his bargaining chip? If he didn't plan to capture Li Tianlan alive? There were too many ifs. How good would it be if none of them happened? In the great regret, Prince Renwu suddenly shook the long knife in his hand. The knife light surged up, and there was a patch of dark green in the twisted airflow. Prince Renwu managed to stabilize his body, then he raised the knife and moved forward. The mountain fell and the ground cracked. The lightning and the dark green knife light intertwined and chopped at Li Tianlan. Vaguely, the silver-long spear in his sight turned into two swords. The sword light flashed. Prince Renwu seemed to hear the sound of the joints in Li Tianlan's body exploding, and there seemed to be a surging power pouring out of his body like a river. Prince Renwu still didn't feel the sword intent, and there seemed to be a sharp sword light in the light. There was no sword intent and the world was filled with killing intent. Jian Shirsi, slaughter. The bright sword light instantly chopped the chaotic airflow caused by the explosion of the grenade. Li Tianlan didn't even look at Prince Renwu. He rushed past him and went straight to heavenly calamity. The sword light forcibly chopped countless airflows and lightning. The long knife in Prince Renwu's hand was broken, and the green light scattered. In front of him, the whole world was broken into pieces. Countless blood lines spurted out from his body. With a muffled sound, his arms, legs and head were all separated from his body. The sword intent exploded in his body, and the body of the Prince of East Island, who was trying to change a princess a few minutes ago and was supposed to have a bright future, was directly torn into pieces. Help me. Seeing that the grenade didn't work, Heavenly Calamity finally couldn't suppress the fear in his heart anymore, and he suddenly shouted at the front. There were still 300 meters. At this distance, Li Tianlan could save him. The forest in front of him was dark and silent. Li Tianlan's figure behind him came quickly, and he was getting closer and closer. Heavenly Calamity clenched his teeth and turned around directly. A large amount of blazing fire rose up around him, and there was lightning in the fire. Heavenly Calamity had a grim smile on his back, and in his hand, he had already taken out a very simple shotgun, but the muzzle was very deep. The shotgun was a little longer than a normal pistol, and its caliber was also a little bigger. It was completely gray and didn't look very eye-catching. But this gun was one of the most famous pistols in the whole dark world. Famous gun whisper. Li Tianlan's figure swooped down. Facing Li Tianlan, Heavenly Calamity's figure moved back quickly, and at the same time he held whisper and fired quickly. Bang bang bang. Dense gunshots exploded in the forest, and countless bullets flew towards Li Tianlan in the air. Li Tianlan's figure seemed to have disappeared completely. Behind Heavenly Calamity, there was only a ball of fire that was burning at its limit. Heavenly Calamity shot crazily and his face was grim. In his sight, the fiercely burning flames suddenly exploded, and countless sparks flew out, covering all the area within dozens of meters. There was even ice in the sparks. Ice and fire were flying, and Li Tianlan's figure kept flashing in the spreading ice and fire, as if he was everywhere. In the blink of an eye, he had shortened the distance again with the flying ice and fire, and rushed directly to Heavenly Calamity. Bang bang bang. Completely out of instinct, Heavenly Calamity shot regardless of the consequences. The bullets rushed to Li Tianlan, and Li Tianlan also rushed to him. 2 bullets pierced through Li Tianlan's abdomen and shoulders and blood splattered. Li Tianlan's expression was cold, and he approached Heavenly Calamity instantly. The human emperor changed from a sword to a dagger, and the human emperor stabbed the upper part of Heavenly Calamity's hand. A large amount of blood suddenly rose with Heavenly Calamity's scream. Crazy. This guy was crazy. Heavenly Calamity's heart was filled with unprecedented fear. The whisper in his hand kept shooting bullets, but Li Tianlan didn't dodge and almost rushed straight to the bullets. He waved his saber. One after another, deep saber wounds appeared on Heavenly Calamity's body, and blood flew unscrupulously in the darkness. There was Li Tianlan's blood, and there was Heavenly Calamity's blood. Li Tianlan's face was pale, but his eyes were like those of a wild beast, and it seemed that he was going to tear Heavenly Calamity apart. Heavenly Calamity had to die. He had to die. Repeating this thought over and over like hypnosis, Li Tianlan's actions became crazier and crazier. Swish. Heavenly Calamity, who finally saw what a lunatic was, seemed to be completely desperate. Suddenly he threw the whisper in his hand and like throwing a stone, the whisper hit Li Tianlan's head hard. Blood splattered. Li Tianlan looked at Heavenly Calamity, who had thrown away the gun in his hand, and subconsciously froze for a moment. In this extremely rare gap, Heavenly Calamity, who was covered in blood and whose upper body was almost torn apart by the human emperor, suddenly jumped up and kicked Li Tianlan's chest hard. An explosive sound suddenly burst out from his body, and his whole body, like a meteor, rushed to the forest in front of him at an extreme speed. Li Tianlan chased after him without hesitation. A dark figure suddenly appeared next to Li Tianlan and pressed his shoulder. A low and deep voice sounded beside his ear, solemn and dignified. "Don't move, it's dangerous." Li Tianlan's eyes flashed with scarlet and bloodthirsty light, and he stared coldly at the dark figure in front of him. "I'm Saint," the dark figure said in a calm and brief tone. His whole body was covered in a black cloak, and he carried an ordinary-looking long sword on his back, looking extremely mysterious. "Horsewoman is fine. Everyone is fine. Today's fight is just to save people. That's enough." Saint stood in front of Li Tianlan motionlessly, looking at the forest in front of him, and said in a calm tone, "Enough?" Li Tianlan raised his eyebrows, and there was undisguised coldness in his tone. "Even if it's not enough," Saint's voice was hoarse and he said softly, "it's not suitable to continue the chase today." Through the black cloak, his eyes were fixed on the forest in front of him. It was silent in front of the forest. But intuitively, Li Tianlan could sense that Heavenly Calamity didn't seem to run away immediately. "Who's over there?" Saint suddenly asked. His voice was hoarse and calm, and it echoed in the forest hundreds of meters away. There seemed to be a large amount of sword intent in the air, rising and falling like tides. It was quiet in the forest. After a short silence, Saint continued, "Which murderous weapon is it?" "Murderous weapon." Li Tianlan was suddenly shocked, and the red light in his eyes faded away. He woke up from the state of slaughter, and his perception suddenly became sharp. At this moment, Li Tianlan stared at the forest in front of him, and all his hair stood on end. Just in front of him, there seemed to be an extremely huge and dangerous aura in the dark trees. It seemed to be motionless, but in a trance, it seemed to devour the world. That huge sense of oppression was looming, but it was with fatal ferocity and violence. In that majestic momentum, Li Tianlan suddenly felt his own insignificance and powerlessness. Murderous weapon. One of the 12 murderous weapons in the dark world. Chapter 184. A chapter of more than 5,000 words. The murderous weapon didn't move. Saint didn't move either. The desolate atmosphere filled the world, and the atmosphere was so oppressive that it almost solidified. Li Tianlan's boiling blood gradually calmed down and then became cold. It was piercingly cold. He was in a trance in the dark rain. Relying on his intuition, Li Tianlan could almost clearly feel the muzzle of the murderous weapon pointing at him from a distance. A huge sense of oppression and crisis completely enveloped him, as if he would turn into wisps of dust after a loud noise. Confrontation. It was quiet in the mountain forest. Li Tianlan's pupils had been extremely condensed, and the sharpness in his eyes had completely disappeared. His eyes were full of thick darkness and deathly stillness. The world was full of killing intent. The killing intent was invisible and intangible, but it tore his clothes silently. One after another, bloody wounds appeared all over his body. The wounds were very thin and shallow, but the blood kept flowing. Li Tianlan clenched the human emperor in his hand and suddenly took a step forward. Saint's expression hidden behind the cloak changed dramatically, and he straightened his body almost instantly. Li Tianlan's face was expressionless, and his pupils were dark and gloomy. The killing intent driven by the murderous weapon in the forest was turbulent fiercely as he moved forward. The pressure was like a mountain, and the naked and cruel evil spirit turned into real killing intent, wrapping Li Tianlan layer by layer. Li Tianlan continued to move forward. The second step. His entire body was already covered in blood, yet his body still stood ramrod straight as he passed through the layer upon layer of killing intent emitted by the murderous weapon. An extremely fierce battle will seem to have risen from the ground and shot straight into the curtain of rain above. In this life I can't be defeated and I can't retreat. If I fail I will die. There is no way back. Saint's eyes were slightly relaxed. In his perception, in the mountain forest hundreds of meters ahead, the intense danger that even he could clearly feel seemed to be quietly retreating. It retreated but did not disperse. The mountain forest in front of him seemed to be full of fierce killing intent, which was integrated with heaven and earth, like the rising sun and the setting moon, irresistible. The killing intent in the air gradually receded. The danger gradually receded. Saint grabbed Li Tianlan's shoulder and retreated to the battlefield at the back with him. The battlefield was a mess. This chaotic battle that had only lasted for a few minutes was extremely tragic. Those who survived naturally did not have it easy. As for the dead, not to mention a complete corpse, not even the most fragmented parts were left. The knight and the duke were leaning against each other. Both of them looked abnormally dispirited. Both of them had pale faces and were covered in blood. Their auras were also declining. There was no doubt that the knight was wronged. Heavenly Calamity was known as the contemporary Gun King, and the power of Grimm's smile was amazing enough. But it was not so easy for him to kill a top thunder-shocking realm master like Knight. If Knight got close, Heavenly Calamity could not even hold on for half a minute under Knight's attack. Even if Knight could not break through the blockade of Heavenly Calamity's firepower, it was not easy for Grimm's smile to hit Knight. But tonight, Knight stood straight and took the second shot of Grimm's smile without dodging. Now he was only seriously injured, but he still had some strength left, which showed that the guardian of the Supermaster of Samsara deserved his reputation. Dongqing Rushi had already woken up, as if she had just woken up from a dream. Her clear eyes were full of confusion, and she looked a little confused. Seeing Li Tianlan and Saint walking back together, her eyes slightly brightened. She struggled to get up and walk to him, but then she seemed to think of something. She waved her two tender white hands, and the night rain suddenly condensed into blue frost, and then turned into a cloud of semi-liquid water vapor. She forcefully wiped her dirty little face, but after so many days of fleeing, her face was dirty, so how could her palms be clean? As a result, she made use of the water vapor to smear her face more and more dirty. Unknowingly, she had smeared her dusty but still recognizable face into that of a real tabby cat. Even Li Tianlan, who was full of hostility, did not know whether to laugh or cry when he saw this scene. Saint's body slightly trembled in the black robe. As for Knight and Duke, they did not even look at her, as if they were afraid that laughing would affect their internal injuries. Dongqing Rushi also seemed to find something strange. She looked at her hands subconsciously, but she did not scream or get angry. She just stood there quietly looking a little silly. "Don't wipe it. Go back and do it slowly." Li Tianlan walked over and said softly. He looked at the people beside Dongqing Rushi who were still in a coma and shook his head. Coma was the most instinctive self-protection mechanism of the human body, which was good for their recovery. "I'm very beautiful." Dongqing Rushi looked at Li Tianlan with her clear eyes that were as bright as stars and said in a serious tone, "I can see that." Li Tianlan nodded. Facing Dongqing Rushi, it seemed that he had a headache and was a little embarrassed in any situation. "I told Grandpa that I would marry you after I graduated. Last time you went to my house, I ran away. Are you angry?" Dongqing Rushi could look straight into Li Tianlan's eyes at first, but in the end she subconsciously lowered her head. Suddenly, Li Tianlan's blood appeared in her sight. The gunshot wounds and knife wounds were exposed to the air through the torn clothes. Although Saint had helped to take out the bullets and put medicine on them, the 4 or 5 bullet holes still looked very shocking. Dongqing Rushi raised her head again and looked at Li Tianlan with burning eyes. Her voice was a little cold, but with a trace of natural and clear childish voice. It sounded very soft. "Are these wounds for me?" "No." Li Tianlan's heart sank for no reason. Feeling the vague eyes of the 3 supermasters of Samsara around him, he felt a pain in the ass. He directly pointed at Li Baidian and the others on the ground. "These are all my brothers, so that's why." Under the bright eyes, Li Tianlan broke out in a cold sweat for no reason. It seemed that his injuries were relapsing, and it was difficult for him to speak. "You're still angry." Dongqing Rushi looked at Li Tianlan quietly. Even her tone was quiet, and there was no trace of grievance in her voice. Li Tianlan wanted to deny it, but he felt that this feeling was really weird. He said helplessly, "It doesn't matter at all. The most important thing is whether you like me or not, and whether you want to marry me, isn't it?" "I do." Dongqing Rushi's tone was soft as if she was being hypnotized. Li Tianlan asked her if she wanted to marry him, but she said she did. What Li Tianlan wanted was an answer, but what Dongqing Rushi gave him was an inevitable result. Did it matter? It didn't seem to matter. "Grandpa said that I can only marry you." It was still that kind of quiet tone. It was not a kind of despair but a kind of calmness with a heart like a starry sky. She said softly, "Grandpa said that I can only marry you." Li Tianlan couldn't understand how much pressure, seriousness, and desire were contained in this sentence. He only felt a little headache, but he couldn't hide his pride. Of course he would never admit it. But perhaps every man would understand the kind of secret pleasure in his heart. Let's go back first. Saint suddenly said, "This is not a place to stay for a long time." The first supermaster of Samsara rarely spoke, but once he did, Li Tianlan felt that he was very natural and confident. Duke didn't know him for a long time, but when they occasionally chatted, Li Tianlan enjoyed some flattery from the fourth supermaster of Samsara. Duke was naturally an expert, but in Li Tianlan's heart, his moral integrity had long fallen to the ground, and he didn't have any demeanor of a supermaster at all. Horsewoman was relatively soft and docile, and she just carried out Qin Weibai's orders. Flaming Fire's hostility to him was almost undisguised, or maybe she couldn't hide it, but she couldn't touch him. Li Tianlan felt conflicted for her. Only Saint was calm, mysterious and indifferent. He was not cold, but his aura was extremely high. Only in him, Li Tianlan felt a little bit of the temperament of the supermaster of Samsara. Li Tianlan nodded. Each of them took one person and carried the unconscious people on their backs. Through the forest. On the way back. About 5 kilometers away from the forest, an inconspicuous appearance of a bus had already stopped there. Under the dim night sky, the bus was like a well-disguised big bread. The tiny but conspicuous headlights shone on the winding road in front of them. The rain was drawn along the light into obvious silk lines. Saint walked in the front. Without greeting the driver, he carried Su Chu, who was the heaviest on his back, directly into the bus. The inside of the bus was not much different from the ordinary bus, but the distance between the seats was so wide that it made people feel relaxed and happy. The seats were all made of leather, which was soft and comfortable. Saint threw the behemoth Su Chu on the sofa, found a seat at random and calmly ordered, "Start the bus." The engine of the bus made a very surging roar, and the bus slowly started. Li Tianlan put down Li Baidian on his back and then sat beside him, panting. The medicinal powder that Saint applied to him on the way was very effective. When the medicine entered his body, he felt a sense of coolness all over his body, and even his spirit seemed to recover a lot. But this kind of medicine took effect quickly, and the time it lasted was also very short. After carrying Li Baidian for several kilometers, Li Tianlan barely made it to the bus. He was dizzy and his body seemed to be empty. The feeling of weakness kept hitting his body, as if it was going to pull his consciousness into the darkness. Li Tianlan gritted his teeth and suddenly asked, "Which murderous weapon is it?" Murderous weapon. Before Saint opened his mouth, Duke beside him was suddenly shocked. He looked at Li Tianlan and then at Duke, and his expression suddenly became serious. "You were chasing Heavenly Calamity, and you encountered a murderous weapon? Is it in Heavenly Calamity's hands?" "No." Saint was silent for a while and then shook his head and said, "No force dares to lend a murderous weapon to Heavenly Calamity, and he is only in the fire-flaming realm. How useful can a murderous weapon be if it is given to him? The person with the murderous weapon is hiding in the darkness and he didn't shoot, so we can't tell which murderous weapon it is." Li Tianlan panted, subconsciously touched his pocket, and took out a pack of cigarettes. But he didn't hold it firmly and it fell directly under the sofa. Dongqing Rushi, who was sitting beside him, bent down to pick it up and lit it for him without saying a word. Li Tianlan took a big drag on the cigarette, trying to cheer up his consciousness, which seemed to be about to pass out at any time. Of all the people present, it seemed that no one noticed that when he was chasing Heavenly Calamity, there was one less person on the original battlefield. Maybe someone noticed it, but they never suspected it. When did Dawn leave? Li Tianlan suddenly asked, and there was a kind of well-concealed coldness in his tone. Saint was slightly stunned, glanced at Li Tianlan, and then narrowed his eyes, looking at Duke and Horsewoman. "Tianlan, you suspect it was Dawn? There's no reason." Paladin said subconsciously. "I just want to ask when he left." Li Tianlan said calmly. Dawn and Daybreak basically belonged to the same force, but he didn't know what this force was called, or what kind of cooperation this force had with Samsara. According to Duke, this matter seemed to involve the top secret of Samsara, and at present, only the master of Samsara Palace and Qin Weibai knew everything. Everything was unknown, so naturally there was no way to infer. But any seemingly flawless kindness, on the contrary, was most likely to become the most fatal danger, and he still understood this truth. This was also an important reason why Li Tianlan had not even let down his vigilance against the Dongqing clan until now. What kind of cooperation did the force behind Dawn and Daybreak have with Samsara? In such a cooperation, would his death lead to some other results of this cooperation? Li Tianlan was not sure about this, but he could be sure that there was still such a possibility. The dark world was full of black and blood. How could good and evil be clearly seen under the intertwining of these two colors? Horsewoman thought for a moment, and her face suddenly became a little ugly. He almost disappeared when you went after heavenly calamity. But there's still one thing that can't be explained. Saint suddenly said, the mysterious force behind them should not have a murderous weapon. Li Tianlan took a drag of the cigarette and asked. Now 11 of the 12 murderous weapons in the dark world have clear owners. They either belong to the superpowers in the dark world or some world-class powers, and the missing one has not appeared for many years. The only thing we can be sure of is that the murderous weapon is not damaged, but it is missing. In terms of time, the missing time of the murderous weapon is even earlier than the time when the Li family's infinite sky was destroyed. Duke explained softly, and the mysterious force we are cooperating with this time is just a dark force that has risen in recent years. Many of their foundations are not even perfect, so it has nothing to do with the missing murderous weapon. And the time doesn't match. Li Tianlan took a drag of the cigarette and tried to blink his eyes to prevent himself from passing out. He said calmly, is there no murderous weapon in East Island? The three super masters of samsara looked at each other and seemed a little strange. East Island. There used to be. In the organization of Night Spirit. Duke smiled and said in a playful tone. Li Tianlan suddenly understood. The murderous weapon Blue Sky Underworld. This was the murderous weapon that used to belong to Night Spirit, and it could also be said to belong to East Island. But with the destruction of Night Spirit, this killing weapon, which ranked very high among the 12 murderous weapons, was now in the hands of the master of Samsara Palace. East Island had no murderous weapon now. Even if East Island could borrow a murderous weapon, it would not give it to Dawn. And this murderous weapon tonight has nothing to do with East Island. Otherwise the other side would not have retreated tonight, and it would have been better to shoot directly. Obviously they don't want to attract East Island's attention. At least, they don't want East Island to know that there is a murderous weapon that can threaten the superiors of the invincible realm in their territory. Saint narrowed his eyes and he looked more and more profound. The person behind this has a big plan. Li Tianlan's eyelids became heavier and heavier. In a trance he seemed to remember the night when he first met Daybreak. That night, Daybreak once said that the barrel of Grimm's Smile, the famous gun in Heavenly Calamity's hand, was given to Heavenly Calamity many years ago. This was a superpower that was really hiding in the dark. What was the real face behind the darkness? Li Tianlan wanted to say something, but his consciousness became more and more dizzy. Darkness came to his eyes and he passed out completely. There was silence in the bus. Dongqing Rushi sat beside Li Tianlan, staring at his face blankly. The light in her beautiful big eyes became dimmer and dimmer. She tried to blink a few times, but she refused to open her eyes again. The bus passed through the night rain, running on the mountain road at a high speed. The raindrops pattered on the window, and the atmosphere in the whole bus became a little weird. The bus went straight down. As far as the eye could see, in the distance in the rain, there seemed to be lights faintly. Duke finally spoke. He looked at Horsewoman seriously and said calmly, should we tell the palace master about what Tianlan said? The dark cloak covered Saint's face and his expression couldn't be seen, but his tone was still calm. Don't worry. I will contact them again in the near future. Let's talk about it then. I don't think so. What happened tonight was too dangerous. If you hadn't arrived in time. Duke thought of the sword that instantly shattered Rattlesnake's body hundreds of meters away, and then he thought of Heavenly Calamity's shot. He shook his head. In fact, you were still late. There is no if. Saint suddenly shook his head. Even if I didn't show up, nothing would have happened. He turned his head and seemed to look at Duke through the cloak. He said in a low voice, have you forgotten Dongqing Rushi's sword? Duke's expression froze, and the sword intent of myriad paths peerless appeared in his mind. He opened his mouth and said subconsciously, how did you do that? Saint was a little confused. I mean, how did you turn that sword into another sword? Duke was smiling, but his smile was very forced. Saint was silent for a full 5 minutes and then he said slowly, that sword strike was the real invincible sword intent, which was equivalent to the full attack of an invincible realm expert. It was the remaining sword intent in the silent sword, and Dongqing Rushi could trigger it at the cost of her life in that sword. Do you think I could suppress such a sword strike? And even turn it into another sword? Duke forced a smile as if he was suppressing the fear in his heart. So you didn't do it? Saint's body stiffened. After a long time he said blandly, "Of course it wasn't me. If it wasn't Saint, who else could it be?" Duke didn't dare to think about it for a moment. If it wasn't Saint, it meant that just now, under everyone's eyes, there was a super expert who made a move? He was able to suppress Dongqing Rushi's invincible sword and hide it from everyone's eyes. There was no doubt that he was also a real invincible realm expert. Why did such a person save Dongqing Rushi? Did an invincible realm expert make a move just to save people? Duke tried to make himself believe in this kind reason, but he felt more and more uneasy. It was obviously a good result, but all he could feel was malice. Now East Island, Saint hesitated and said blandly, "The situation is out of everyone's control. Anyway, be careful from now on." He glanced at Li Tianlan, who was in a coma, and continued, "Anyway, protect this guy. If something happens to him, the boss will go crazy." "I'll try my best." Duke smiled, but his smile looked worse than crying. Saint didn't say anything. He just quietly turned his head and looked out of the window. Through the cloak and the blurry window, the rain and lights outside the car were mixed together, hazy and blurry. The night was thick. The road ahead was bleak and blurry. Only the rain flew tirelessly and messily, sprinkling all over the city. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.